On a gray morning in the summer of 1762, a woman rode out of St. Petersburg at the head of an army that was not hers, wearing a uniform that was not hers, on a horse borrowed from an officer she barely knew. She was 33 years old. She had been born in a draughty little German town to a father with a title and almost no money. She spoke Russian with a soft foreign accent that she would never entirely lose, and she had spent 18 years in a court that watched her, mocked her, opened her letters, and waited for her to fail. Behind her rode 14,000 soldiers of the Imperial Guard. Ahead of her, 20 miles away at a seaside palace, sat her husband, the lawful emperor of all the Russias, who had ruled for 6 months and was about to discover that he no longer ruled anything at all. By nightfall, the empire belonged to her. She would hold it for 34 years. In that time, she would add to Russia lands the size of a kingdom, plant cities on empty steppe, correspond with the sharpest minds in Europe, buy whole art collections out from under the noses of kings, and write more words in her own hand than most professional authors of her century. She would also crush a peasant rising that shook the empire to its foundations, sign away the freedom of millions, and help erase a neighboring country from the map of Europe altogether. Her admirers called her the Semiramis of the North. Her enemies called her a usurper. The philosophers of Paris called her the greatest woman of the age, and she paid some of them handsomely for the compliment. In the century that followed, gossip would bury her under a mountain of invented scandal. Most of it untrue, all of it repeated, and beneath the noise there remained a plain and remarkable fact. A minor German princess, with no army, no fortune, no legal claim, and no blood tie to the Russian throne, took that throne by nerve alone, and then governed better than most of the men born to it. This is the story of Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, who became Catherine II, and who is remembered as Catherine the Great. Settle in now. Lower the lights, let your shoulders drop, and let the cold northern air of this story move over you slowly. If you feel like it, leave a comment telling us where in the world you are listening from, and what time it is where you are. We always like to know who is out there in the dark. To understand how a foreign girl came to rule Russia, you first have to understand what Russia had just been through, because the empire she inherited was less than 40 years old, and it had been built at terrible speed by one enormous and terrifying man. That man was Peter, called the Great, and he had died in 1725, 4 years before Catherine was born. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, which in that centuries made him a giant among men, and he had spent his life dragging a medieval kingdom into the modern world by the beard. That is not a figure of speech. He taxed beards. He cut them off nobles with his own hands at banquets, because in the Russia of his youth a long beard was a sign of piety and old ways, and Peter had decided that old ways were killing his country. Before Peter, Muscovy had been a vast, cold, inward-looking realm of forests and rivers and wooden towns. Its rulers were tsars in the old style, half emperor and half abbot, surrounded by black-robed clergy and boyars in long brocade coats that swept the floor. Its women of high birth lived shut away in a separate part of the house called the terem, where they embroidered and prayed, and were rarely seen by men outside the family. Its calendar was different from the rest of Europe. Its army was brave and badly organized. Its trade ran mostly overland, slowly, at the mercy of weather and bandits, because Russia was enormous and almost entirely landlocked. Peter looked at all of this and decided that a country without a coastline was a country without a future. So he went to war for the sea, and he went abroad to learn how the rest of the world worked. He traveled to Holland and to England under a thin disguise, calling himself a carpenter, and he learned shipbuilding with his own hands, and he came home with engineers and gunners and doctors and rope makers in his baggage train. Then he did the most extraordinary thing of all. On a swamp at the mouth of the river Neva, in ground so wet that the workers had to drive piles down through mud before they could lay a single stone, he built a city and named it for his patron saint. St. Petersburg rose out of marsh and fog on the bones of the laborers who dug its foundations. Tens of thousands died of fever and exhaustion in those first years. It was, people said, a city built upon corpses. But it faced west. It had a harbor. Ships from Amsterdam and London could tie up at its quays. Peter moved his capital there from Moscow, moved his nobles there whether they wished to go or not, ordered them to build stone houses on ground of his choosing, ordered them to shave, ordered their wives and daughters out of the terem and into low-cut European gowns at compulsory evening parties where dancing was not optional. He created a navy where there had been none. He beat the Swedes, then the finest army in the north in a long and bloody war, and by the time he was finished, Russia was not a curiosity on the edge of the map. It was of power. The cost was appalling. Peter taxed everything. He conscripted peasants for life. He tightened the chains of serfdom until a Russian peasant was, in every practical sense, the property of the man whose land he worked. He had his own son arrested, interrogated and beaten, and that son died in a fortress cell. Peter's Russia was a machine of iron and terror that produced, at the end, a genuine European great power, and it left the country exhausted and unbalanced, like a body that has grown too fast for its own bones. And then he died, and the machine had no clear drive. Here is the flaw that would shape everything that came after. Peter had abolished the old rule of succession. Under the ancient custom, the crown passed from father to eldest son. Peter, having killed his own heir, decreed instead that each ruler could simply name a successor. It sounded modern and flexible. In practice, it meant that whenever a monarch died without naming anyone, or named someone weak, the throne belonged to whoever could seize it. And in St. Petersburg, the people who could seize it were the Guards regiments quartered in the capital. For the next 37 years, Russia was ruled by a strange and unstable procession. Peter's widow, a Lithuanian peasant girl who had been a laundress before she was an empress, ruled for 2 years as Catherine I, then a boy of 11. Then a niece, Anna, who ruled for 10 years through a hated German favorite, while court life curdled into cruelty and elaborate humiliations, including a famous wedding of 2 jesters held inside a palace made entirely of ice. Then an infant emperor, less than a year old, and his mother as regent. And then, on a freezing night in 1741, a daughter of Peter the Great walked into the barracks of the Preobrazhensky Guards, put on a breastplate, told the grenadiers that she was the child of their old master, and asked them whom they would follow. They followed her. The infant emperor was taken from his cradle and carried away into a captivity that would last his whole short life. The regent's German advisors were arrested. By dawn, Elizabeth Petrovna was Empress of Russia. Remember that night. 21 years later, a young German woman who had watched Elizabeth's court from the inside would do almost exactly the same thing, with almost exactly the same regiments, and she would do it better. Elizabeth was a striking, restless, deeply pious, and thoroughly frivolous woman. She loved dancing, French fashion, masked balls at which men were made to dress as women and women as men, and she is said to have owned 15,000 dresses, and to have refused to wear any of them twice. She was also, in one respect, genuinely humane. On taking the throne, she swore an oath that she would sign no death warrants, and for 20 years she kept it, which in the Europe of that century was close to unheard of. But Elizabeth had no children of her own, or none she could acknowledge. And so, secure on her father's throne and haunted by the knowledge that other branches of the family had their own claims, she looked around for an heir. She found him in a small German duchy on the Baltic, in the person of her sister's orphaned son, a thin, pale, nervous boy of 14, named Karl Peter Ulrich of Holstein-Gottorp. She sent for him. He arrived in Russia in 1742, was converted to the Orthodox faith, renamed Peter Fyodorovich, and declared Grand Duke and heir to the empire. He was a disaster. Everybody could see it almost at once, and the Empress, watching her nervous little nephew fail to grow into anything resembling a ruler, decided that the solution was to marry him off quickly to a suitable princess and hope for a grandson. That decision, taken in a palace on the Neva by a woman who wanted a baby to raise as a proper Russian, would change the history of a continent, because the princess she chose was a 15-year-old girl from a shabby little court in Pomerania. And that girl had a mind like a steel trap and an ambition she had not yet admitted even to herself. She was born on the 2nd of May in 1729 in the port town of Stettin on the Baltic coast, in a plain house on a narrow street in a garrison fortress. Her name was Sophie Friederike August von Anhalt-Zerbst. Her father, Christian August, was a Prussian general and the younger son of a minor princely family. He was a decent, dutiful, thoroughly unremarkable man who commanded a regiment, attended church, kept careful accounts, and had almost no money of his own. His title was grander than his income by a wide margin, which was the ordinary condition of a great many German princes in that century. Germany was not a country then. It was a patchwork of hundreds of duchies and margraviates and free cities and churchlands, and the smaller ones existed largely to supply Europe with soldiers, officials, and marriageable daughters. Her mother was another matter entirely. Johanna Elisabeth of Holstein-Gottorp was 16 years younger than her husband, beautiful, vain, restless, and endlessly dissatisfied. She had been married off at 15 to a stolid officer twice her age, and had never stopped resenting it. She wanted movement, intrigue, importance. She wanted, more than anything, to matter in the great world, and she spent her life traveling to spas and courts and cousins in pursuit of that feeling. Johanna had wanted a son. She got Sophie, and the daughter later remembered, with a clarity that never quite lost its sting, that her mother did not trouble to hide the disappointment. When a son did arrive a year and a half later and turned out to be sickly, Johanna's attention fastened on him entirely. The boy would die at 12. In the meantime, Sophie was raised by servants and governesses, praised for being clever and scolded for showing it, and told with great regularity that she was plain. It is worth pausing on that childhood, because almost everything Catherine became can be traced back to it. She was not beautiful as a child. She had a long chin and a nose that was too large for her face, and she knew it because she was told. At about 7 years old, she developed a curvature of the spine so pronounced that one shoulder rode higher than the other. A local executioner, who in that century doubled as a bone setter, was quietly brought in to treat her. He prescribed a hard corset of ribbon and wood that she was made to wear day and night for years, and a strange ritual in which a young girl was brought each morning, fasting, to rub the child's back and shoulder with her own saliva. The treatment, whatever we make of it now, appears to have worked. The spine straightened, but she had spent the most tender years of her life laced into a frame, being told she was crooked and plain, and learning that if she wanted to be noticed, she would have to be interesting instead. So she became interesting. She read. She asked questions, and when the answers bored her, she went and found better ones. She had a French governess named Elizabeth Cardell, whom she called Babet, a Huguenot exile with a dry wit and a good library, and this woman became the first person Sophie ever loved without reserve. Babet taught her French, which was then the language of every civilized court in Europe. More importantly, Babet taught her to think of reading as pleasure rather than duty, and slipped her the plays of Molière and Corneille and Racine alongside the improving religious texts. There was also a Lutheran chaplain, a stern man named Wagner, who was supposed to teach her the catechism and who found himself instead in a long-running argument with an 8-year-old. She wanted to know why the great men of antiquity, who had never heard of Christ, must be damned. Wagner could not satisfy her and lost his temper, and she noted quietly that losing one's temper was what people did when they had run out of reasons. That habit of pressing a question until the person opposite stopped being able to answer it would follow her into the imperial council chamber, where it was rather more useful. She was clever, watchful, and unloved, and she developed the survival skill of the clever, unloved child everywhere, which is charm. She learned to be pleasant to everyone, to remember what people cared about, to defer to those who needed deference and flatter those who needed flattery, and to keep her real opinion somewhere behind her eyes where nobody could get at them. It is a skill that looks like sweetness and is in fact armor, and she wore it for the rest of her life. Meanwhile, her mother took her traveling. Johanna dragged her daughter around the courts of northern Germany, visiting relatives, angling for invitations, showing off her family connections. This was ordinary practice, a sort of marriage market conducted in draughty castles over long dinners, and it gave Sophie something no formal education could have. By the time she was 14, she had seen how a dozen courts worked from the inside. She had watched who deferred to whom, who was in favor and who was quietly finished, how a well-timed compliment could open a door, and how a careless remark could close one forever. She was collecting data, without knowing what she would use it for. On one of those journeys at Eutin in 1739, when she was 10 years old, she was introduced to a distant cousin. He was 11, a pale boy with pale hair, thin and jumpy, and already fond of soldiers and of wine. His name was Karl Peter Ulrich of Holstein-Gottorp. The grown-ups murmured about the two of them in the way that grown-ups do, and Sophie, who missed nothing, understood that a match had been mentioned. She thought at the time, and wrote later with unsparing honesty, that she did not like him very much, but that the idea of a crown was extremely agreeable. She was 10 years old. Already the two things were separate in her mind. The man was one question, the throne was another, and she had noticed which of them interested her. There is a story told by Catherine herself and by others that around this time a traveling canon in Brunswick studied the girl and announced that he saw 3 crowns upon her forehead. Johanna laughed at it. Sophie did not. Whether the prophecy was real or invented afterwards to decorate the legend hardly matters, because the important part is that the child believed something like it. She had grown up second best in her own nursery, and she had decided, somewhere in that hard corset in that cold house, that she was going to be somebody. Then, at the very beginning of 1744, a letter arrived in Zerbst from Russia, and everything changed at once. It came from Berlin, forwarded through the Prussian court, and it was an invitation from the Empress Elizabeth of Russia. The Princess Johanna and her eldest daughter were requested to come to Russia. They were to come immediately in the depth of winter, traveling under assumed names, and they were to tell nobody why. They did not strictly need to be told why. The whole thing had been arranged behind the scenes by 2 men who wanted opposite things from it. The first was Frederick II of Prussia, later called Frederick the Great. A young king with a formidable army and an eye on Russia, who wanted a Prussian-friendly girl beside the Russian heir, and who had been quietly pushing Sophie's name for months. The second was the Empress herself, who had her own private reason. Elizabeth had once been engaged to Sophie's maternal uncle, a handsome young prince of Holstein, and he had died of smallpox a few weeks before the wedding. Elizabeth never married. 40 years later, she still kept his portrait. When the name of that dead young man's niece came before her, it landed on a soft place in a hard woman, and Elizabeth said yes. So a girl of 14 was chosen for the greatest throne in Eastern Europe, partly because of a Prussian king's calculation, and partly because of an old grief in an empress's heart. Neither of them had the faintest idea what they were sending for. The journey was appalling. They left in January, traveling as the Countess of Rhinebeck and her daughter, in unheated carriages across a frozen continent. From Berlin to Riga, and on toward St. Petersburg, the roads were sheets of ice and rutted snow. At one stage, they traveled in a covered sledge lined with straw and furs, packed in like goods, so cold that Sophie's feet lost all feeling and had to be rubbed back to life. They stopped at wretched post houses, where the whole family of the innkeeper slept in the same room as the guests. At one halt, Sophie later remembered lying on a bench beside a stove, listening to soldiers on the other side of a thin wall, aware that her whole life was being carried east at the pace of a horse, and that she had no power at all to stop it or turn it around. Her father did not come. Christian August was a devout Lutheran, and he understood perfectly well that this journey ended with his daughter renouncing her faith and joining the Orthodox Church. And he could not bring himself to witness it. He rode with them only as far as the frontier. There he handed her a sheet of paper on which he had written, in his careful soldier's hand, a set of instructions for her life in Russia. Respect your husband. Do not meddle in politics. Be kind to the Russians. Keep your expenses within your income. Do not become the tool of any faction. Then he embraced her and turned his horse and rode home. She never saw him again. He died 3 years later, and the Empress would not permit her to wear full mourning for more than 6 weeks, on the grounds that he had not been a king. They crossed into the Russian Empire at Riga, and the whole texture of the journey changed in an instant. Where before there had been anonymous cold, now there were sledges lined with sable, footmen in imperial livery, an escort of cuirassiers, silver plate at dinner, and cannon fired in salute. Sophie sat wrapped in furs she had never owned the like of, riding through pine forests and past frozen lakes toward Moscow, and she understood exactly what she was being shown. This was what the empire could give. She had only to be what it wanted. She arrived in Moscow on the 9th of February in 1744, and was taken straight to the palace, and there she met the Empress and the young man she had been brought halfway across Europe to marry. Elizabeth Petrovna was then in her middle 30s, magnificent, generous, changeable, and slightly terrifying. She came into the room in a hoop-skirted gown covered with silver, with diamonds in her hair, and she looked the girl over, and she liked what she saw. She had expected a docile little German. She found a self-possessed, quick-eyed teenager with beautiful manners and an obvious desire to please, and for the moment that was exactly right. The Grand Duke was less encouraging. Peter Fyodorovich was 16 now. He had been in Russia for 2 years and had learned almost no Russian. He was delighted to see Sophie and told her so at length, and then made clear the reason he was delighted. She was a relative. She was German. She was somebody he could talk to. Within a very short time, he was confiding in her about the girl at court he was actually in love with, on the reasonable assumption that his future wife would find this interesting. Catherine wrote later, looking back across half a century, that she was quite prepared to like him. that she would have been a faithful and affectionate wife had he wanted one, and that she understood almost at once that he did not want one and never would. He wanted a playmate and an audience. What she needed, and what he was constitutionally unable to give, was an ally, so she made her decision. It was not a decision about him at all. She wrote, with the terrible clarity that runs through all her memoirs, that from the beginning she resolved on 3 things: to please her husband, to please the Empress, and to please the Russian nation. And she added, because she was honest with herself, if with nobody else, that if the first proved impossible, she would concentrate very hard on the other 2. That is the whole of her career in one sentence, formed at 15, in a foreign palace, in a language she could not yet speak. She set about becoming Russian with a thoroughness that startled everybody. She hired a tutor named Vasily Adodurov and worked at the language like a scholar under examination. Russian is not an easy tongue for a German speaker. It has 6 cases, a shifting stress that changes meaning, and an alphabet she had to learn from scratch. She would get out of bed in the night in her shift and walk barefoot on the cold floor of her bedroom, repeating vocabulary aloud, because she found that the cold kept her awake and the movement helped her remember. She caught pneumonia. Of course she did. It was March, the palace was freezing, and she had been pacing stone floors in her nightclothes for weeks. She fell into a violent fever that lasted 27 days, and for a stretch of it, she was not expected to live. She was bled repeatedly, which was the medicine of the day and which certainly did her no good at all. She lost so much weight that when she finally rose from the bed, her face had changed shape, and in the middle of that illness, half conscious, she did the single cleverest thing of her early life, and she did it by instinct. Her mother, panicking about her daughter's soul, wanted to send for a Lutheran pastor to attend the dying girl. Sophie, surfacing out of fever, said no. Send instead, she said, for Simon Todorsky, the Orthodox priest who had been teaching her the Russian faith. Send for him, because she would rather talk to him. The story went round the palace within the hour, and then round Moscow, and then round the empire. The little German princess, at the point of death, had asked for an Orthodox confessor. Elizabeth wept over her bedside and put a diamond necklace worth a fortune beside her pillow. The Russian court, which had spent 40 years being ruled through German favorites and had come to loathe the very sound of a German accent, decided that this one was different. This one had a Russian soul. Whether the 15-year-old calculated it or simply preferred the priest she liked to the one her mother chose, we cannot know. But she never afterwards let anyone forget it, and she was never again seen as merely a foreign import. She had bought, with a single sentence spoken from a sick bed, something that money and armies cannot buy, and she spent the rest of her life drawing on the account. She recovered slowly through the spring. In June, she was received into the Orthodox Church in a long and beautiful ceremony, and she recited the creed in Russian, aloud from memory, in a clear voice that carried the whole length of the chapel, and the congregation was visibly moved. She took a new name, chosen by the Empress in honor of her own mother. From that day, she was Yekaterina Alexeyevna, Catherine. The next day, she was formally betrothed to the Grand Duke and given the title of Grand Duchess and Imperial Highness. She was 15 years old. She had been in the country 5 months, and she had already made herself, in the eyes of the Russian people, more Russian than the heir to the throne. The betrothal lasted a year and a bit, and it was not a happy one. Her mother saw to that. Johanna, having got her daughter to Russia, could not resist trying to become important herself. She let the Prussian ambassador use her. She passed on court gossip, took sides in factional quarrels, and repeated things she should not have repeated. Elizabeth, who employed a very effective secret chancellery and read a great deal of other people's correspondence, watched this for a while and then acted. Johanna was summoned, dressed down in front of witnesses, and told in the plainest terms that her behavior was intolerable. She spent the remainder of her time in Russia in a kind of internal exile, humiliated and sulking, and she blamed her daughter for not defending her. Catherine learned 2 lessons from watching her mother destroy herself. The first was that letters are never private. The second was that the moment you become useful to a foreign power, you become expendable to your own. She would be accused of many things in her life. She was never again caught doing what her mother had done. Then, that winter, the Grand Duke caught smallpox. He was taken to a country house to be nursed, and Catherine was kept strictly away from him since she had never had the disease. He nearly died. For weeks the court held its breath, because if he died, the whole careful arrangement collapsed, and Catherine would be sent home to Zerbst as a used piece of diplomacy, 16 years old and worth nothing on the marriage market. He lived, and in February she was brought to see him, in a room lit by candles, and she did not recognize the person sitting there. Smallpox had eaten his face. He had been thin and unremarkable before. Now he was scarred all over, his features swollen and pitted, his hair gone, wearing an enormous powdered wig that made his head look grotesque on his narrow shoulders. Catherine, who was 16 and had not learned yet to keep her face entirely still, recoiled. He saw it. He was already a boy with almost nothing in the way of self-worth, and he watched the girl he had been promised flinch from him in candlelight, and something in him closed for good. It is easy to make Peter into a comic figure, and his contemporaries did, and Catherine herself in her memoirs painted him as a drunken half-wit with the mind of a child. Some of that is fair. A great deal of it is the deliberate work of a woman justifying a coup. What is quite clear when you set the malice aside is that he was a damaged and frightened person, orphaned young, beaten by his Holstein tutors, dragged to a country whose language and religion he did not want, told daily that he was inadequate and that the empire was waiting for him to fail, and now disfigured at 17. He responded the way such people often do. He clung to the one identity that had ever made him feel strong, which was his adoration of Prussia and its soldiers, and he retreated into a world of toys and drill and drink where nobody could reach him. They were married on the 21st of August in 1745 in St. Petersburg, in a ceremony that lasted for hours under a weight of gold and jewels that left the bride with a headache she remembered for the rest of her life. The celebrations went on for 10 days. There were fireworks over the Neva, an artificial mountain of illuminated glass, banquets, balls, an ox roasted whole for the crowds, and fountains that ran with wine. And then the 2 of them were put to bed, and nothing happened that night, or for a very long time afterwards. The physical facts of the marriage are one of the enduring puzzles of the century, and no honest account can tie them off neatly. What we can say is that by every indication, including Catherine's own testimony and that of the Empress's doctors and courtiers, the marriage was not consummated for years. Catherine wrote that on their wedding night, her husband talked to her about a servant girl until he fell asleep, and that things went on much like that. Some sources point to a minor physical condition on his side that a small operation could correct, and hint that the operation was eventually performed. Others believe the problem was entirely in the mind, in the shame of a boy who had been mocked all his life and could not bear to fail in front of yet another person. It may well have been all of these at once. What is beyond doubt is the effect. Catherine spent her late teens and early 20s as a wife who was not a wife, in a country she had adopted, watched constantly, blamed publicly for the absence of an heir, which was the only thing anyone required of her. That watching was relentless. The Empress, growing impatient, placed spies in her household in the person of a series of governesses and stewards whose actual job was to report. The most notorious was a woman called Maria Choglokova, appointed specifically to supervise the young couple and to enforce marital relations, which is a task no one has ever performed successfully. Catherine was told whom she might speak to. Her letters were read. Her reading was inspected. When she wrote to her own father, she was made to submit the letters to the Foreign Office first. She had almost no money of her own and ran up debts to buy the small presents and small kindnesses by which she kept the goodwill of the people around her. She was, in the middle of gilded rooms and enormous ceremonies, extremely lonely. The court itself was a peculiar mixture of magnificence and squalor. Elizabeth kept a wandering household, moving between the Winter Palace and Peterhof and Tsarskoye Selo and Moscow, and each move required thousands of carts. The palaces were beautiful in the state rooms and often bare and cold behind them. Windows did not fit. Chimneys smoked. Rats ran in the corridors. At one temporary palace in Moscow, Catherine recalled, water ran down the inside of the walls, and there were so many bedbugs that she could not sleep, and moved a mattress into a passage. On another occasion, the whole wooden palace burned down in a night, and she watched a river of rats and mice pour out of the building in a solid stream, fleeing the fire. Elizabeth's own habits made the household stranger still. She dreaded assassination in her bed, as any monarch who has taken a throne by night might, and so she slept at irregular hours and often by day. The whole court had to be available whenever she was awake. Courtiers dozed in antechambers at 4 in the morning waiting to be called. She would order a masquerade at short notice, and everyone would dress and dance until dawn. She adored young people and could be enormously generous, giving Catherine jewels and gowns and warm words. And then a week later she would sweep in and scream at her for an hour over a trifle, and Catherine would stand with her hands folded and her eyes down and say nothing at all. So how does a highly intelligent young woman survive 18 years of that? She read. This is the part of the story that gets least attention and matters most. Between about 1746 and 1761, in the empty afternoons and the long northern evenings, shut out of politics and short of company, Catherine gave herself the finest education available to anyone in Europe, and she did it entirely on her own initiative. She began with novels because she was young and bored, and she got through them quickly and found them thin. She moved to history. She read the letters of Madame de Sévigné for their style. Then she found Voltaire, and by her own account the world changed shape. She read everything of his she could obtain, and she never stopped. Then Tacitus in French, and she said afterwards that Tacitus caused a revolution in her head, because Tacitus taught her to look at the stated reasons for political actions and then look underneath them for the real ones. Then came the heavyweights. She read Montesquieu's great book on the spirit of the laws, and read it repeatedly, and filled notebooks with it. She read Bayle's enormous critical dictionary, which took her 2 years at a rate of 1 volume every 6 months. She read the Encyclopedia of Diderot and d'Alembert as the volumes appeared. She read Plutarch, Cicero, Plato, the German legal theorists, the histories of Germany and of France, and the annals of Russia itself in 9 thick volumes. She was not reading to pass the time. She was reading the way a person reads who intends to use it. She was assembling, in a locked bedroom in St. Petersburg, a working theory of how a state ought to be governed. and she was doing it in the certain knowledge that the man who would one day govern this particular state was in the next room drilling servants with wooden muskets. Because that is what he did. Peter's private life in those years is one of the melancholy comedies of the 18th century. He kept a regiment of toy soldiers, some of them wooden, some of them wax, some of them starch, arranged on tables in his rooms, and he maneuvered them by the hour and held courts martial and executions among them. He trained real servants in Prussian drill in his apartments. He got a pack of hunting dogs and kept them in his bedroom where the smell was so bad that Catherine could not enter. And he trained them with a whip until they howled. He played the violin loudly and badly and believed himself a virtuoso. He drank with his Holstein officers and told long stories in German. And once, famously, Catherine came into a room to find him solemnly hanging a rat which he had condemned by court-martial for eating one of his starch soldiers. And he explained the charges to her with complete seriousness, and she went away and laughed until she cried, and then, one imagines, stopped laughing. He was not cruel to her in the beginning. He confided in her, asked her advice about his mistresses, complained to her about the Empress. For a time, they were something like allies, two foreign children in a hostile palace. But he could not forgive her for being cleverer than him, and the Russians could not forgive him for openly despising them. And over the years the gap widened until they were strangers who shared a set of apartments and a title. Everyone at court could see the arithmetic. Elizabeth would not live forever. The throne would pass to a man who called Russia a cursed country, who wore a Prussian order under his coat, and who had told several people in his cups that when he was emperor he would divorce his wife, shut her in a convent, and marry his mistress. Catherine, in the next room, went on reading Tacitus. By 1752, the Empress had run out of patience. 7 years of marriage had produced no child, and an empire that had already changed hands 5 times in 27 years needed an heir the way a ship needs ballast. Elizabeth stopped waiting for nature and began, in her practical and entirely unsentimental way, to arrange matters. The instrument was a young courtier named Sergei Saltykov, and he was chosen because he was suitable rather than because he was good. He came from an ancient Russian family. He was handsome, dark, elegant, experienced with women, and about as trustworthy as a cat. He was also already married. Maria Choglukova, the very governess who had been appointed to enforce the marriage, was the one who quietly cleared the way, because she had understood that her real orders were not to protect the Grand Duchess's virtue, but to produce a baby. Catherine was 23. She had been ignored for 7 years by a husband who preferred toy regiments to her company, watched by paid observers, and told constantly that her failure to conceive was a failure of duty. Saltykov paid attention to her. He was the first man who ever had. She fell in love with him with the whole force of a nature that had been given nothing to spend itself on, and she suffered 2 miscarriages. And then at last, in the autumn of 1754, she gave birth to a son. He was named Paul Petrovich. The question of who fathered him has been argued for 250 years and cannot be settled. Catherine's own memoirs, written much later, are worded so as to suggest strongly that the child was Saltykov's, which was a useful suggestion for a woman whose son would one day claim her throne. Against that, Paul grew up looking startlingly like Peter, with the same features, the same jerky manner, the same obsession with Prussian drill, which is a strange coincidence if there was no blood between them. The likeliest answer is that we will never know, and that Catherine herself may not have been certain. What matters is not the paternity. What matters is what happened in the room. The moment the child was born, the Empress took him. not figuratively. Elizabeth was present at the birth, and she had the baby washed and wrapped and carried out of the room to her own apartments, and the doors closed behind her, and the entire court followed her out to admire the heir. Catherine was left lying on a leather mattress on the floor near a draughty window, sweating, in the clothes she had labored in, without water, without help, and no one came back for her for hours. She lay there shaking with cold and thirst, and nobody thought of her at all, because her single function had been discharged. She saw her son once, briefly, at 6 days old. She was not permitted to nurse him, or to hold him, or to have any part in his upbringing. Elizabeth took him away, installed him among elderly nurses in overheated rooms wrapped in fur and flannel, and raised him herself, badly. Catherine saw the boy perhaps 3 times in his first year. She did not raise him. She was not allowed to love him, and by the time she was allowed near him, he was already a nervous, sickly, suspicious little stranger who had been taught that she was somebody unimportant. The consequences of that would run through the rest of both their lives. Paul grew up believing, with some justice, that his mother had abandoned him. Catherine grew up in the palace, unable to be a mother, even when she wished to be. And later, when she had power, she repeated the pattern with a completeness that ought to disturb us. She took Paul's own sons away from him and raised them herself. Saltykov, meanwhile, was rewarded for his services by being sent abroad as an envoy, which is to say he was removed. He wrote once or twice, then stopped. When Catherine learned that he had gone about Europe describing the whole affair as a conquest, something in her went hard and stayed hard. She had learned the last of her early lessons. Love was a luxury for people with power. If she wanted a life of her own, she would have to build the power first. The years that followed are the quiet years, and they are the years in which she stopped being a victim of the court and became a player in it. She grew up physically and socially. She was not beautiful in the way courts of that period admired, but by her middle 20s she had something better. She held herself very straight. She had a long neck, an intelligent face, dark blue eyes with a great deal of humor in them, and chestnut hair, and above all, she had the gift of making the person in front of her feel like the only person in the room. Contemporaries who met her expecting a plain woman came away insisting she was lovely, which is generally a sign that beauty had very little to do with it. She had also worked out the geometry of the court. She was open-handed to servants, courteous to the elderly, respectful to churchmen. She learned the names of the guards' officers. She dressed simply on Russian holy days and stood through the long Orthodox services without visible fatigue, which impressed people enormously. She played cards badly and paid her losses generously. She lent money she did not have. She built, slowly and without ever appearing to be building anything, a reputation as the one member of the imperial family who behaved like a Russian. And she took a second lover, and this one mattered. Stanislaw Poniatowski was a young Polish nobleman of exquisite manners and genuine cultivation who arrived at St. Petersburg in the suite of the British ambassador. He was 22. He was clever, bookish, romantic, and rather delicate, and he adored her. For 4 years they were lovers, and it was, by the account of both, the closest thing to a happy love affair either of them had. He was the father, almost certainly, of the daughter Catherine bore in 1757, a little girl named Anna Petrovna, who lived only 15 months. Peter's reaction to that pregnancy is one of the strangest small moments of the whole story. Told that his wife was expecting again, he remarked to a companion that God alone knew where she got her children, and that he was not at all sure any of them were his, but supposed he had better accept them as such. He said it publicly, without much heat. His own domestic life by then was entirely conducted with his mistress, Elizabeth Vorontsova, a plump, coarse, pockmarked young woman whom he genuinely loved and whom the court found astounding, since she was so obviously the opposite of his wife in every way. Perhaps that was the point. The affair with Poniatowski dragged Catherine into politics for the first time, and it nearly destroyed her. Europe in those years was rearranging itself. In 1756, the 7 Years' War broke out, and Russia entered it on the side of Austria and France against Prussia. This was the Great War of the Age, fought from Silesia to Canada to Bengal, and for Russia it meant marching west to fight Frederick the Great. Russian armies won hard battles. They occupied East Prussia. In 1760, a Russian force actually entered Berlin, and the heir to the Russian throne cheered for the other side. Peter made no secret of it. He wore the Prussian Order of the Black Eagle. He drank the health of Frederick, whom he called his master, at Russian tables. He passed information about Russian troop movements to the Prussian ambassador, which in any other man would have been treason, and which in him was treated as an embarrassment. Russian officers came home from bloody campaigns to find the future emperor toasting the enemy who had killed their men. They did not forget. Catherine, meanwhile, was doing something more dangerous and much better concealed. She was corresponding with the Chancellor, Alexei Bestuzev, the most powerful minister in Russia, and with the British ambassador who had brought Poniatowski to Petersburg, and she was borrowing British money to fund her household and her friends. She was also in contact with Field Marshal Apraksin, commanding the armies in the field. Her aim was simple and treasonous in the strict sense. She was preparing for the Empress's death. Elizabeth had begun to have seizures. When she died, Peter would be emperor, and Catherine had no intention of being sent to a convent. She wanted allies in place. In 1758, it came apart. Apraksin, after a victory, unaccountably retreated and was arrested for it. Bestuzev fell with him, and among Bestuzev's papers were letters to and from the Grand Duchess. The Chancellor did one decent thing before the police reached him. He burned the correspondence, but everybody knew it had existed, and Catherine spent weeks waiting in her rooms for the knock. Her friends were being questioned. Her secretary was arrested. She was cut off, ignored, and left in silence, which is a technique any secret police would recognize. So she did something extraordinary. She went on the attack. She wrote to the Empress, in Russian, in her own hand, and asked to be sent home to Germany. She said she had failed to please, that her husband did not want her, that she was a burden, that her children were being raised by others and did not know her, and that she therefore begged to be returned to her family. It was a bluff of magnificent nerve, because being sent home was the one thing she dreaded, and the one thing that would have solved everybody's problem. She was betting that Elizabeth would not do it. Then she took to her bed and asked for a priest. The priest, who was Elizabeth's own confessor, listened to her for an hour and a half and came away entirely on her side. And at last, at 10 o'clock on a spring night in 1759, Catherine was summoned to the Empress's apartments for the confrontation she had been preparing for. It is one of the great scenes of the century, and we have it from her. The room was lit by candles. Elizabeth stood by a table on which lay Catherine's letters. Peter was there. Alexander Shuvalov, the head of the secret chancellery, stood by, and behind a screen everyone in the room knew stood at least one more listener. Catherine went in, and before anyone could speak, she crossed the floor, dropped to her knees and burst into tears, and begged to be sent home to her mother. It broke the interrogation open before it began. Elizabeth, who had come to accuse, found herself instead raising the girl from the floor and telling her not to be ridiculous, that she could not be sent away, that she had children in Russia. Catherine, still weeping, answered that her children were in the Empress's hands and that she had never been permitted to see them. Peter, unable to leave anything alone, began interrupting with accusations of pride and malice. Catherine answered him quietly and precisely, and let him talk himself into looking like a spiteful fool, which he obligingly did. Elizabeth walked over at one point, close, and said in a low voice that she remembered how much reading the Grand Duchess did, and how many books. And Catherine said that the Empress must also remember how many books she had read herself. By the end of it, the Empress was telling her, half aloud, that there was a great deal more she would like to say, but that she could not, because they were not alone. Catherine walked out of that room with her position intact. She was not sent home. She was not arrested. She had gone in as a suspect in a treason inquiry and come out as a wronged daughter-in-law. And she had done it on her knees, in tears, with total control. She was 30 years old. She had learned the last thing she needed to know, which was that she could win. Elizabeth Petrovna died on Christmas Day in 1761 by the Russian calendar after a long decline of strokes and swellings and nosebleeds that no doctor could stop. She was 52. She had reigned for 20 years without signing a single death sentence, had built the Winter Palace, founded a university in Moscow, and left the treasury empty and the succession in the hands of a man everyone in her empire had learned to dread. Catherine, when the news came, did exactly the right thing, which was nothing at all in public and everything in private. She put on black. She sat by the coffin in the church, hour after hour, day after day, through the enormously long Orthodox funeral rites, kneeling on stone, praying visibly, weeping for the dead Empress. Ordinary Petersburgers filed past and saw the Grand Duchess in mourning, still and devout, and they talked about it in the taverns and the markets. Her husband, the new emperor, could not sit still through any of it. He fidgeted, he whispered. He made faces at the priests behind their backs. At one point during the funeral procession, he amused himself by deliberately falling behind, then running to catch up, so that the elderly courtiers carrying the train of his mourning cloak were dragged along at a trot. And he laughed at them. People saw that too. Peter III reigned for 186 days, and it is genuinely difficult to think of a way he could have used them worse. He was not, whatever Catherine's memoirs claim, wholly stupid, and some of what he did was sensible or even generous. He abolished the secret chancellery, the political police, which was a real reform and a popular one. He issued a manifesto freeing the nobility from the lifelong state service Peter the Great had imposed on them, which delighted the nobles enormously. He stopped the persecution of the old believers, the religious dissenters, who had been hounded for a century. Any of these done by a ruler who understood his country might have founded a reign. But he did not understand his country, and he had no interest in learning. His first great act was to end the war with Prussia. Russia had fought Frederick for 5 years. 50,000 Russians and more were dead. Russian armies held East Prussia, sat in Berlin, and had Frederick so near destruction that the king kept poison in his pocket. Peter did not merely make peace. He gave back every inch of conquered territory without asking for anything at all, wrote to Frederick as a devoted servant, took a Prussian general as an advisor, and then announced that Russia would now fight alongside Prussia in a new war against Denmark, over a small piece of land called Schleswig, which mattered to Peter personally as Duke of Holstein, and mattered to Russia not in the slightest. Imagine you are a Russian officer who has spent 5 winters campaigning in Prussia. You have buried friends at Zorndorf and at Kunersdorf, where the bodies lay in heaps. You come home, and your new emperor hands the ground back for nothing, praises the enemy commander as the greatest man alive, and orders you to march again, immediately, against a country you have no quarrel with, for a duchy on the Baltic you have never heard of. Then he took away your uniform. That sounds trivial. It was not. Peter reorganized the Guards regiments on the Prussian model, replaced the green Russian coats with tight Prussian blue, imposed drill of a rigidity the Russians found humiliating, and made it clear that he regarded his Holstein troops as superior soldiers. He talked of abolishing the Guards altogether and scattering them to the frontier. The Guards were the oldest regiments in the army, created by Peter the Great, full of noblemen's sons, quartered in the capital, and possessed of a very clear historical memory of the fact that they had personally made the last 3 sovereigns. Insulting them was not a policy error. It was suicide. He also went after the church. Peter announced the secularization of monastic lands, which would take enormous estates and something like 1 million peasants out of the hands of the monasteries and into the hands of the state. This was an idea Catherine herself would carry out 2 years later, so we cannot call it madness. But he combined it with open contempt for orthodox practice. He told the clergy to shave their beards and dress like Lutheran pastors. He ordered the icons removed from churches except for those of Christ. He was seen laughing during the liturgy. To a deeply orthodox country whose peasants understood almost nothing about politics, but understood icons completely, this was the behavior of a man who was not merely a foreigner, but possibly not a Christian at all. And through all of it, he treated his wife with a public brutality that was, from a purely tactical point of view, insane. He installed his mistress Elizabeth Vorontsova openly at court, and let it be known that he intended to divorce Catherine and marry her. He gave Vorontsova the Order of St. Catherine, which was the Empress's own decoration. At a state banquet in the summer of 1762, celebrating the peace with Prussia, with hundreds of guests and the entire diplomatic corps present, he proposed a toast to the imperial family. Catherine remained seated, as was proper for a member of that family. Peter sent an adjutant down the table to ask why she had not stood. She replied that she was of the imperial family. He sent the man back, and then, when she still did not rise, he shouted the word "fool" at her down the length of the table, in French, in front of everyone. She sat still, and let her eyes fill with tears, and then turned to the chamberlain beside her and asked him to tell her a funny story so that she would not weep in public. Every soul in that hall watched a dignified woman being humiliated by a small man, and every soul in that hall drew a conclusion. That night, on the emperor's orders, an officer was sent to arrest her. He was talked out of it by Prince George of Holstein, Peter's own uncle, who pointed out that arresting the Empress would cause a scandal, so the order was withdrawn, and the emperor went to bed, and his wife was left at liberty for 1 more month. That was the mistake that killed him, because Catherine had spent that spring doing what she had been preparing to do for 15 years. She was building a conspiracy, and she was very good at it. Her lover by then was Grigory Orlov, and he was the reason it worked. Orlov was an artillery officer of no particular birth, enormously tall, enormously strong, handsome, brave, careless, popular, and famous in the army for a story from the Battle of Zorndorf, in which he was wounded 3 times and refused to leave the field. He was one of 5 brothers, all soldiers, all built the same way, and all of them known and liked by the men of the Guards. Grigory gave Catherine his loyalty. His brother Alexei, a huge man with a scar across his face and a colder mind, gave her the organization. The Orlov brothers spent months in the barracks and the taverns, drinking with sergeants and junior officers, spending money Catherine borrowed from foreign merchants and talking. They did not need to argue very hard. The regiments already hated the Prussian uniforms and the Danish war. What the Orlovs supplied was the alternative, and the alternative was the German princess who had knelt for 2 weeks beside Elizabeth's coffin and who spoke Russian and crossed herself the Russian way. Others came in. Princess Ekaterina Dashkova, 19 years old, brilliant, hero-worshipping, and in one of the finer ironies of the story, the younger sister of the emperor's mistress. Nikita Panin, the tutor of young Paul, a cautious and experienced statesman who wanted Peter gone, but would have preferred to make the boy emperor with Catherine as regent. Kirill Razumovsky, the hetman of the Ukrainian Cossacks and colonel of the Izmailovsky Guards. 100 conspirators at the core, perhaps 40 times that many soldiers who had a general idea that something was coming. They planned to move in July. They moved in June, because on the 27th, a captain named Pasek was arrested after one of the men in his company reported him for saying that the Empress would soon be on the throne. The news reached Alexei Orlov in the small hours. He rode straight to Peterhof, 20 miles from the capital, where Catherine was staying in a small pavilion by the sea, and he woke her at 5 in the morning. He said, according to her own account of it, that it was time to get up, that everything was ready to proclaim her. She asked what had happened. He told her about Pasek. She understood in a moment that the choice was gone. Either she moved now or she would be arrested within the day. So she got up, put on a black dress, refused breakfast, and got into a carriage with Orlov and drove for St. Petersburg. Halfway there, the horses were failing, and they were rescued by a passing peasant cart. On the outskirts, they were met by Grigory Orlov, and she transferred to his carriage, and they drove straight to the barracks of the Izmailovsky regiment. It was 6 in the morning. The soldiers came tumbling out half-dressed. Their priest came out with a cross. Catherine got out of the carriage in her black dress, with her hair loose, and told them that the emperor intended to arrest her and kill her son, and that she placed herself in their hands. They knelt in the mud and kissed her hands and swore for her. The regiment's colonel arrived, embraced her, and had her proclaimed Empress on the spot. Then they marched to the Semyonovsky regiment, who came out to meet them shouting for her before they arrived. Then the Preobrazhensky, Peter the Great's own regiment, where a couple of officers, loyal to the emperor, tried to hold their men and were swept aside. Then the Horse Guards, who went so wild with enthusiasm that Catherine had to ask them to be quieter. By 9 in the morning, she was in the Kazan Cathedral, and the Archbishop of Novgorod was proclaiming her sole and autocratic empress of all the Russias. By 10, she was in the Winter Palace, where the Senate and the Synod came and swore allegiance. Little Paul was fetched from his bed in his nightclothes and shown at a window with his mother, and the crowd roared. Not one shot had been fired. Not one person had died, and the emperor of all the Russias knew nothing about any of it. He was at Oranienbaum, along the coast, and had spent the morning happily, and was now traveling to Peterhof for a name-day dinner in his honor. He arrived to find the palace empty. Nobody was there. The dinner was not laid. His wife's rooms were vacant, her bed not slept in. He searched the pavilion himself, and looked under the bed and even, absurdly, in a wardrobe, calling her name. Then a messenger arrived from the city with the news. What Peter did in the next 12 hours is painful to read. He wavered. Old Field Marshal Munich, 80 years old and a veteran of a dozen crises, told him to go straight to Kronstadt, take the fleet, and then sail to the army in Prussia, which had never seen Catherine and would follow its emperor. It was good advice. It might well have worked. Peter half took it. He sent an officer to secure Kronstadt, and dithered, and by the time his galley reached the fortress at 1 in the morning, the admiral loyal to Catherine had already arrived and taken command. A voice from the walls called across the black water that there was no emperor any longer, only an empress, and that if the boat came closer they would fire. He collapsed. He was rowed back to Oranienbaum. He wrote a letter to his wife offering to share the throne. She did not answer. He wrote again, offering to abdicate if he might be allowed to retire to Holstein with his mistress and his violin and his dogs. She sent him a document to sign. He signed it. It said that he felt himself incapable of governing the Russian state, and that he renounced it for the whole of his life. Frederick of Prussia, who liked him and lost by his fall, said afterwards that he had let himself be driven from the throne as a child is sent to bed. Catherine, who was 33 years old and had ruled Russia for 1 day, rode back into St. Petersburg at the head of the guards, wearing the old green Russian uniform that Peter had taken away from them, with a sprig of oak leaves in her hat, sitting a gray horse. The city was awake in the streets. Church bells were ringing. It was the height of the northern summer, when the sky at midnight is the color of a pearl, and it never really gets dark at all. She had been awake for 2 days. There remained the problem of what to do with a deposed emperor, and the 18th century had only ever found one durable answer to that question. Peter was taken under guard to a small country house at Ropsha, about 20 miles from the capital, to wait while a suitable fortress was prepared for him. Alexei Orlov commanded the guard. Peter asked for his dogs, his violin, his German servant, and his mistress. He was allowed the dogs and the violin and the servant. Vorontsova was sent away. He wrote pitiful little notes to Catherine asking for permission to walk in the garden and complaining of headaches and signing himself her most humble servant. He had colic. He drank. On the 6th of July, 8 days after the coup, he was dead. The official announcement said that he had died of a hemorrhoidal colic aggravated by an attack of the heart. The phrasing was so transparently absurd that it became a joke across Europe within weeks. Nobody believed it. Nobody has believed it since. What actually happened at Ropsha is not fully knowable. The account that has come down rests largely on a letter, supposedly written by Alexei Orlov to Catherine in a state of drunken panic, saying that there had been a quarrel at table, that the guards and the emperor had come to blows, and that before they could separate them he was dead, and that they did not remember what they had done and begged her forgiveness. The original of that letter has never been produced. Catherine is said to have kept a copy in a box which her son Paul opened after her death, and to have destroyed the original. And the whole chain of custody is exactly as murky as one would expect. The likeliest reconstruction is a brawl that was allowed to go too far by men who understood perfectly well that a living deposed emperor was a permanent danger to the woman they served, and who did not need written orders to work out what would please her. Did Catherine order it? There is no evidence that she did, and a certain amount of practical argument that she would not have. The death handed her enemies the one accusation that never left her, and she was far too intelligent not to have foreseen that. It stained her at the moment of her triumph, made her a usurper and a husband killer in the coffee houses of Paris, and gave every pretender in Russia for 30 years a ready-made story. But she profited by it, and she covered it up, and she rewarded the men responsible. Alexei Orlov was showered with honors and estates and served her loyally for decades. That is not innocence in any sense that matters morally. It is simply not the same thing as murder. The truthful verdict, and the one most historians reach, is that she did not order her husband's death, and that she permitted the men who caused it to go unpunished for the rest of their lives, and that she lived with the knowledge and never spoke of it. Peter was buried without imperial honors, quietly in a monastery rather than in the imperial vault. His face had darkened, and people who filed past the coffin drew their own conclusions. She was crowned in Moscow on the 22nd of September in 1762, in the Cathedral of the Dormition inside the Kremlin, and she made certain that it was the most magnificent coronation Russia had ever seen. There was a reason for the extravagance. Her legal claim to the throne was, strictly speaking, non-existent. She was not a Romanov, she was not Russian. Her husband had been the grandson of Peter the Great. Her son was the great-grandson. She herself was a German princess, whose entire title to rule was that some regiments had shouted for her on a June morning. Everyone knew it, so she buried the fact under gold. A new crown was made for her, an extraordinary object of 2 gilded silver half-spheres divided by a band of diamonds, hung with nearly 5,000 stones and topped by an enormous red spindle the size of a hen's egg. It took the jewelers 2 months. She walked into the cathedral through a crowd of nobles, took the crown from the archbishop, and placed it on her own head with her own hands, as Peter the Great had done, because a Russian sovereign is crowned by nobody. She wept during the service, and the people who saw it said the tears were real. Then she spent a fortune. She threw silver coins to the crowds, gave a banquet in the Kremlin, ordered fireworks and illuminations, and pardoned prisoners, and remitted debts, and distributed titles and estates and serfs to the men who had made her. Grigory Orlov became a count, so did his brothers. Some 18,000 serfs and around 500,000 rubles went out in gifts within a few weeks. And then, when the noise died down, she sat down and began to govern. And everybody who had assumed she would be a figurehead discovered their mistake very quickly. Nikita Panin had wanted her as regent for Paul. She never mentioned the idea again, and neither did he. Grigory Orlov and his brothers wanted her to marry Grigory and make him her consort, and a scheme to that effect was floated in the Senate in 1763 and shot down flat by an old statesman who observed that a Madame Orlov could not be Empress of Russia. Catherine let it die. She loved Orlov, in her way, for 12 years, and she never for one instant considered sharing power with him. She worked from the beginning harder than any Russian sovereign since Peter the Great. She rose at 5, or by some accounts 6, lit her own fire so as not to wake the servants, made her own coffee, which was so strong that a courtier who tried it is said to have nearly fainted, and sat down at her desk in a plain morning gown with her greyhounds around her feet. She wrote for hours before the court was awake. She read reports, drafted decrees, corresponded with generals and governors and philosophers. She kept that routine, more or less, for 34 years. She was also, from the very first months, sitting on a throne she was not certain of. 2 shadows lay across the reign. The first was the shadow of her own son. Paul would come of age one day, and there were people, Panin among them, who thought that the throne belonged to him and that his mother was a caretaker. Catherine never intended to hand it over, and Paul knew, and the poison between them was there from the beginning. The second shadow was a man in a cell. Ivan VI was the infant emperor whom Elizabeth had removed from his cradle in 1741. He had been a prisoner ever since. He was 22 years old now, and had been shut up almost his entire life, latterly in a cell in the fortress of Schlüsselburg on Lake Ladoga, where his guards were forbidden to tell him his own name. He had grown up half-mad, or perhaps only strange, stammering and religious, aware in some confused way that he was somebody important. Catherine went to look at him once, quietly, and came away and said that he was deranged. His guards had standing orders, written under Elizabeth and confirmed under Catherine, that if any attempt were made to free him, he was to be killed rather than surrendered. In 1764, a young officer of the garrison named Vasily Mirovich, who was poor and in debt and had convinced himself of a destiny, tried to free him. He roused part of the guard in the middle of the night and forced his way toward the cell. The two officers inside carried out their orders exactly. By the time Mirovich reached him, Ivan was dead. Mirovich was tried and beheaded, and the crowd that came to watch stood in near silence. Because Elizabeth had abolished capital punishment in practice, and Russians had not seen a public execution in Petersburg for 20 years. Catherine, who was in the Baltic provinces at the time and had arranged to be conveniently far away, wrote about it with cold relief. 2 rivals had now died in 2 years while she was elsewhere, and she was no longer troubled by either. She was, in other words, exactly as ruthless as her century required. The interesting thing about Catherine is that she was also, simultaneously and quite sincerely, an intellectual reformer who believed in reason and law and the improvement of mankind, and she never seems to have felt the slightest tension between the two halves. Which brings us to the most remarkable document she ever wrote. For 2 years, in the mornings, in her own hand, in French, and then in Russian, she composed an instruction for a great assembly which she intended to summon to give Russia a new code of laws. The existing code dated from 1649 and was a monstrous accumulation of contradictions. She called her document the Nakaz, which simply means the instruction, and it ran to more than 500 articles. It is an astonishing thing for an autocrat to have written. Enormous portions of it are lifted almost word for word from Montesquieu and from the Italian reformer Beccaria, and she admitted as much cheerfully, saying that she had robbed Montesquieu for the benefit of her empire, and that he would forgive her. What did it say? That laws should aim at the greatest good of the greatest number, that every citizen should be equal before the law, that a man is innocent until judged guilty, that torture is a barbarous practice which extracts confessions from the weak and lets the strong go free, and that it should be abolished. That capital punishment is unnecessary in a well-ordered state, that crimes should be punished in proportion to their harm and not to the offense given to a ruler's dignity, that religious toleration is a public good, that the prosperity of a country rests on the condition of its farmers, and that a man works better when he works for himself. It even edged, in the drafts, toward the great forbidden subject. She wrote passages suggesting that serfdom was contrary to the Christian religion and to justice, and that the condition of the peasantry should be improved by law. Those passages did not survive. She showed the draft to trusted advisers, all of them noblemen, all of them owners of serfs, and they cut it. By her own later account, roughly half of what she had written was struck out before publication, and the parts about serfdom went first. She let them go. That single act of surrender, in a quiet room, before the assembly ever met, tells you more about the limits of enlightened absolutism than any amount of theory. Still, what remained was radical enough that the French government banned the Nakaz from circulation in France, on the grounds that it was subversive. In 1767, the Legislative Commission met in Moscow. It was an extraordinary gathering, 564 elected deputies from the nobility, the towns, the state peasants, the Cossacks, and the non-Russian peoples of the empire, including Tatars, Bashkirs, and Samoyeds in their own dress. They brought with them more than 1,000 written petitions from their communities describing their grievances. Nothing like it had been seen in Russia before, and nothing like it would be seen again until the 20th century. The serfs of private landlords, it should be said, were not represented at all. The deputies opened by voting Catherine the title of the Great, the Wise and the Mother of the Fatherland. She refused it, saying that God alone was great and that it was for posterity to judge her. It was a good line, and she knew it. Then they got down to business, and the business went nowhere. The commission sat for a year and a half in more than 200 sessions. The deputies debated with real energy and real courage. A handful of them, including a nobleman named Grigory Korobin, actually stood up and argued that the peasants should be given property rights, and were shouted down by the noble deputies with genuine fury. The merchants wanted a monopoly on trade and asked to be allowed to own serfs themselves. The Cossacks wanted their privileges confirmed. The nobles wanted everything they already had in writing, forever. What emerged was not a new code of laws. What emerged was a photograph of a society in which every single group wanted to enslave the group beneath it. In 1768, war broke out with the Ottoman Empire, and Catherine suspended the commission, saying the deputies were needed elsewhere. It never reconvened. She had learned something very valuable and very discouraging. The Russian nobility would not give up their serfs, and the Russian nobility was the only administrative class the empire possessed. There were, in the whole of that vast country, only a few thousand trained officials. Every governor, every judge, every colonel came from that class. An empress who set out to break them would have nobody left to govern with, and would go the way of her husband. She was not willing to go the way of her husband. So she made a bargain, never written down, which shaped Russia for the next 100 years. She would give the nobility everything they wanted at home, and in exchange they would give her the empire abroad. The bill for that bargain would be presented in 1773 by a Cossack deserter with a black beard who told the peasants of the Volga that he was the Emperor Peter III, come back from the dead. Before we follow her into that fire, we should spend a while in the other Catherine, the one who sat at a desk before dawn, writing letters to men she never met. Her correspondence with Voltaire ran for 15 years, from 1763 until his death in 1778, and it is one of the strangest friendships in European history. He was the most famous writer alive, an old man at Ferney on the Swiss border, feared by kings and adored by everyone who read French, which in that century meant everyone who read. She was a usurper with an accent and a reputation for husband-killing. She wrote first. She flattered him with great skill, not by praising his fame, but by quoting his own lines back at him accurately and asking intelligent questions. He was 70 and vain and delighted, and he answered, and after that neither of them stopped. He called her the Semiramis of the North and the Star of the North, and told her that her law code was the finest monument of the age. She sent him furs and an ivory box she had turned herself on a lathe, and news of her victories and long descriptions of Russia which were partly true. When he died, she bought his entire library, some 7,000 volumes with his notes in the margins, and had it shipped to St. Petersburg, where it remains. There was calculation in it on both sides. She was buying a reputation. In an age before newspapers had much reach, the philosophers of Paris were the opinion of Europe, and a woman with no legal claim to a throne needed Europe to think well of her. Voltaire, for his part, wanted a prince who would actually do the things he argued for, and he was prepared to overlook a great deal in order to have one. He praised her wars against the Turks in terms that make uncomfortable reading. He never asked hard questions about the serfs, but it was not only calculation, and that is what makes it interesting. She really had read him, all of him, for 20 years in a cold bedroom, when nobody was watching, and there was no reputation to buy. When she wrote that his books had formed her mind, she was telling the plain truth. Diderot came in person, and that went rather differently. Denis Diderot was the editor of the Great Encyclopedia, the vast collective enterprise that set out to contain all human knowledge, and he was broke. In 1765, he tried to sell his library to raise a dowry for his daughter. Catherine heard of it and bought the library at a generous price, then told him to keep the books in his own house for the rest of his life, and appointed him her librarian and paid him 50 years of salary in advance. It was the single most graceful act of patronage in the century, and Europe talked about it for years. In 1773, he finally came to thank her, and stayed 5 months, and they met almost every afternoon for hours. He was not a courtier. He was an enthusiastic, untidy, physically demonstrative man who argued with his whole body, and in the excitement of debate he would seize her hands, slap her thighs, and shake her arm, and she came away with bruises. She eventually had a small table placed between them, which is one of the more charming details of her reign. They argued about everything. He wanted her to abolish serfdom, break up the great estates, establish a constitution, free the press, reform everything at once and from the top. She listened with real pleasure, because she loved argument. And then she said the thing that ought to be carved over the entrance to every ministry in the world. She told him that he worked on paper, which endures anything, while she had to work on human skin, which is quite otherwise and rather more ticklish. That is the whole tragedy of Catherine's reign in a sentence, and she saw it more clearly than her critics did. She was not a hypocrite who never meant any of it. She was a reformer who discovered, over 34 years, precisely how much a Russian autocrat could not do. Some things she could do, and she did them, and they lasted. She built one of the greatest art collections on earth, almost from nothing, by simply having more money and more nerve than anyone else in the market. Russia in 1762 had almost no old master paintings. Catherine set agents loose across Europe with instructions to buy whole collections when they came up, and to buy them faster than the King of France or of Prussia could decide. In 1764, she took 225 pictures from a Berlin dealer whose sale to Frederick had collapsed. In 1769, she bought the Dresden collection of Count Bruhl. In 1772, she took the celebrated Crozat collection in Paris, some 400 paintings including Raphael, Rembrandt, Rubens, and Titian, and the French were so appalled at losing it that there were protests. In 1779, she bought the entire gallery of Sir Robert Walpole from his heirs in England, over furious objection in the House of Commons. By the end of her life, she owned around 4,000 paintings, 10,000 drawings, and enormous quantities of engraved gems, which she collected with a passion she herself called a form of gluttony. She housed them in a building beside the Winter Palace, which she called her hermitage, meaning her retreat, and she said with amusement that only she and the mice admired them. Today that collection is the Hermitage Museum, and several million people a year go and look at what one woman bought. She also, in a matter of far greater consequence, faced down smallpox. Smallpox in the 18th century killed roughly 1 in 10 of everyone born, and disfigured many of the survivors, and had a particular habit of destroying royal families. Peter II had died of it at 14. Peter III had been ruined by it. The Empress Elizabeth's fiancé had died of it. Catherine had a son and heir who might catch it any winter. There existed a treatment, not vaccination as we know it, which came later, but inoculation, in which matter from a mild case of smallpox is introduced under the skin of a healthy person to produce a mild illness and lasting protection. It worked, mostly. It also killed a small percentage of those who underwent it. It was practiced in England and violently opposed by most of the medical and religious establishment of Europe. Catherine studied the question, wrote for information, and then, in 1768, sent for an English doctor named Thomas Dimsdale, and had herself inoculated first. She insisted on being first. Dimsdale, who was a careful man, and understood exactly what would happen to him if the Empress of Russia died in his care, asked that the procedure be tried on others beforehand. It was on a few volunteers. Then she had it done in secret at night, with relays of post horses standing ready to carry the doctor to the frontier if things went wrong. She fell mildly ill and recovered, and then had her son Paul inoculated, and then announced the whole thing publicly. The effect was exactly what she intended. Within a fortnight, the nobility were queuing for it. Within 2 years, some 20,000 Russians had been inoculated. Dimsdale was made a baron, given a large pension and a fortune, and sent home. Catherine wrote to Frederick of Prussia, who disapproved of the practice, that she had thought it ridiculous to be afraid of a thing that could be prevented, and she teased Voltaire about the timid French. It is a small episode, and it tells you a great deal. She was willing to risk her own life for an idea, in public, for the demonstration effect, and she understood that in a country like hers the sovereign's example was worth more than any decree. She turned the same energy on education, with less spectacular but real results. Under her, the state founded the Smolny Institute, the first state school for girls in Europe, in a beautiful blue and white convent building on the Neva. Girls entered at 5 or 6 and stayed until 18, cut off from their families almost entirely, on the theory that a new kind of woman had to be grown in isolation from the old kind. They learned languages, history, geography, arithmetic, drawing, dancing, and how to run a household. Catherine visited them, wrote to them, watched their theatricals, and had their portraits painted. It was elitist and strange, and for the daughters of the Russian nobility, transforming. She founded foundling hospitals in Moscow and Petersburg for abandoned children, which took in enormous numbers and, like every such institution in that century, lost a heartbreaking proportion of them to disease. She created a medical college and pushed for trained doctors in the provinces. In 1786, she issued a statute for national schools, aiming at a free 2-tier system in every provincial and district town, with a teacher training college and standard textbooks. By the end of her reign, there were perhaps 350 such schools, with something over 20,000 pupils. In a country of 30 million people, that is a drop in the ocean, and it was still more than had existed before, and it was the skeleton on which the next century built. She reformed the church, or rather she completed what her husband had begun and been destroyed for attempting. In 1764, she secularized the monastic estates. Roughly 1 million male peasants and their families passed from the church to the state, and the monasteries were put on a fixed salary, and more than half of them were closed outright. It was a colossal transfer of wealth. It made the church financially dependent on the crown forever after, and it worked, because she did it while wearing her orthodox piety on her sleeve and never once mocking a priest in public. One metropolitan protested and was tried, degraded, and imprisoned, and died in a cell. She reorganized the administration of the empire itself, and this was perhaps her most durable practical achievement. The provincial reform of 1775 broke Russia into some 50 provinces of roughly equal population, each subdivided into districts, each with a governor and a proper apparatus of courts and treasuries and boards of public welfare. Before it, a province might contain 2 million people and a handful of officials. Afterwards there was, at least on paper, a structure. Much of it survived until 1917. In 1785, she issued two great charters. The charter to the nobility confirmed everything the nobles had been demanding for a century: freedom from compulsory state service, freedom from corporal punishment, freedom from personal taxation, the right to hold property in perpetuity, the right to form assemblies in each province, and the guarantee that a nobleman could be tried only by his peers and could lose his status only by judgment of a court. It made them, for the first time, a legally defined estate with rights. The charter to the towns did something similar for the urban population, dividing townspeople into categories and creating municipal councils. And here we come to the hard part of her reign, the part that no admirer can talk around. Every one of those freedoms rested on the unfreedom of somebody else. When Catherine came to the throne, something close to half the population of Russia were serfs belonging to private landlords, and most of the rest belonged to the state or the church, which was better but not by a great deal. A serf was not, in law, a slave. The distinction was real, and it was also very thin. He was bound to the land, and the land belonged to a nobleman, and in practice he belonged to the nobleman too. He owed either labor on the lord's fields, usually 3 days a week and often more, or a money rent, and in the black earth country of the south, where the soil was good, labor was demanded, and it was crushing. He could not leave. He could not marry without permission. He could be moved from one estate to another, sold with the land, and in practice sold without it. Advertisements appeared in the newspapers offering serfs alongside horses and furniture. Families were separated. A landlord could have a serf flogged at will, could send him to the army for 25 years, which was very close to a death sentence, and after 1765 could sentence him to hard labor in Siberia on his own authority alone. And in that same year of 1767, while the Legislative Commission was still sitting and debating natural law, Catherine signed a decree forbidding serfs to submit petitions of complaint against their masters to the sovereign, on pain of the knout and exile. That is the sentence that always stops people. The woman who wrote that all citizens should be equal before the law made it a criminal offense for the majority of her subjects to complain about their treatment. Worse, she extended serfdom rather than reducing it. She granted away enormous numbers of state peasants to favorites and to officers as rewards, and every such gift turned a state peasant, who had at least a nominal legal personality, into a private serf who had almost none. The figures are disputed, but the order of magnitude is not. Something like 800,000 people were handed out in this way over the reign. She also imposed serfdom on the Ukraine, where the peasantry had until then retained the right to move, and closed that door in 1783. How do we hold this together with the Nakaz, with Diderot, with the woman who wrote that a man works better when he works for himself, partly by understanding the trap she was in, and partly by admitting that she chose to stay in it? The trap was real. She had come to power by a coup made by noble officers of the Guards. Her husband had been killed by noble officers. She had no dynastic right, a living son with a better claim, and no bureaucracy independent of the landowning class. Every study of her reign concludes the same thing. Had she moved seriously against serfdom, she would have been removed, and probably killed and replaced by Paul, and nothing whatever would have improved for a single peasant. But it is also true that she stopped trying quite early, and that after 1773, she stopped even talking about it. In the early years, she encouraged an essay competition on whether peasants should own property, and the winning entry, from a French economist, argued that they should, and she had it published. She toyed with schemes. She experimented on crown lands. She freed no one, and she liked the nobility. She lived among them, danced with them, took her lovers from them, and depended on their affection every day of her life. It is very difficult to spend 34 years being adored by a class and then destroy it. She was a foreigner who had made herself Russian, and part of making herself Russian was becoming, in the end, a Russian landowner in her instincts. The serfs understood the situation with great clarity. There was a persistent belief among them, all through the reign, that the good Tsar wanted them free, and that the wicked nobles were hiding his decree. It is a belief that appears in peasant societies everywhere, and it is usually wrong, and in this case it was very nearly true, and it made the countryside combustible. Meanwhile, there was an empire to enlarge, and here Catherine was unambiguously, spectacularly successful, and here she had a partner. The First Russo-Turkish War began in 1768 over Poland, of all things, and it turned into the most one-sided conflict of her reign. The Ottoman Empire was still enormous, stretching from the Danube to the Persian Gulf and across North Africa, and it still looked formidable from the outside. Inside, it had been decaying for a century. Its army was a mass of half-trained levies stiffened by the Janissaries, who had once been the finest infantry in the world and had become a hereditary, mutinous, privileged corporation more interested in Istanbul politics than in campaigning. Its artillery was antique. Its command was riddled with faction. Against that, Catherine sent two commanders of real quality. Pyotr Rumyantsev was a professional soldier of the new school who trained his men to move fast, to form squares against cavalry, and to attack rather than to besiege. In 1770, on the river Larga and then at Kagul, he beat Ottoman armies several times the size of his own. At Kagul, he had something under 40,000 men against perhaps 5 times that number, and he broke them and drove them into the Danube. And then there was the sea and the naval campaign of 1770, which is one of the most audacious things any European power did in that century. Russia's Black Sea coast did not exist. Her only real fleet was in the Baltic. So Catherine sent it round Europe. A Russian squadron sailed out of Kronstadt, down the length of the North Sea and the Atlantic, through the Straits of Gibraltar and into the Mediterranean, with British officers advising and British ports quietly assisting, and went hunting for the Ottoman navy in the Aegean. It was a voyage of several thousand miles by a fleet with no experience of open ocean, and half the crews were sick by the time they arrived. They found the Turkish fleet in the Bay of Chesme, on the coast of Anatolia opposite the island of Chios, moored in a crowded anchorage. On a July night, Alexei Orlov, the same man who had commanded at Ropsha, sent in fire ships. The Ottoman ships were packed too close to maneuver. The fire spread from hull to hull. By morning, almost the entire Turkish fleet, some 15 ships of the line and dozens of smaller vessels, was ash and floating wreckage, and thousands of men were dead. News of Chesme went round Europe like a thunderclap. Russia, which within living memory had possessed no navy at all, had just annihilated an Ottoman fleet in Ottoman home waters. The war ground on for 4 more years. Plague broke out and traveled north with the armies, and in 1771 it reached Moscow and killed perhaps 100,000 people, and the city panicked. A crowd gathered at a gate to venerate an icon said to protect against the sickness, and the archbishop, trying to prevent contagion, ordered the icon removed. The crowd tore him to pieces on the steps of a monastery. Catherine sent Grigory Orlov to Moscow with troops, and he did his best work of his life there, restoring order, opening hospitals, burning infected clothing, offering money and freedom to those who volunteered to nurse the sick, and quarantining the city until the plague burned out. Peace came in 1774 at a village on the Danube called Küçük and the terms changed the map of the East. Russia took the fortress of Kerch and the strip of coast between the Dnieper and the Bug, and the right to sail merchant ships freely on the Black Sea and through the straits into the Mediterranean. That last clause alone was worth the war. For the first time in history, Russian grain could go out through the southern ports. More significant still, the Crimean Khanate was declared independent of the Ottoman Sultan. The Crimea had been a Tatar state under Ottoman protection for 3 centuries, and for most of that time it had been the terror of the Russian and Ukrainian steppe. Tatar raiders had carried off captives by the hundreds of thousands over the generations and sold them in the slave markets of Kaffa. Independence, everyone understood, was a polite word for the first step in annexation, and Catherine slipped into the treaty a clause allowing Russia to make representations on behalf of a new church she was to build in Istanbul. In time, Russian diplomats would inflate that small provision into a claimed right to protect all Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman Empire, and that claim would help start the Crimean War 80 years later. She was building things that would outlive her in every direction, including the ones she never intended. The treaty was signed in July of 1774. It ought to have been the triumph of the reign. But by then Catherine had almost no attention to spare for the Danube, because for a year the whole eastern half of her empire had been on fire. In the autumn of 1773, in the country of the Yaik Cossacks along the river that is now called the Ural, a man appeared among the settlements and told the people there that he was the Emperor Peter III. His name was Yemelyan Pugachev. He was a Don Cossack in his early 30s, a deserter, illiterate, with a black beard and dark eyes and a scar or two, who had served in the Prussian and Turkish wars and had drifted for years between arrests and escapes and religious dissenters. He looked nothing like Peter III. Almost nobody who heard him had ever seen Peter III. That turned out not to matter in the slightest. He told them that he had not died at Ropsha at all. He had escaped, wandered the world in disguise, seen the sufferings of his people, and come back now to take his throne from his German wife, and to give the peasants their freedom. He showed marks on his body, which he said were the imperial sign. He appointed his ragged followers as generals and field marshals, and named them for Catherine's own ministers, and he set up a court in a village with a captured band playing. It sounds like farce, and within a few months he had 100,000 followers and 100 cannon, and had put a third of the Russian Empire beyond the reach of the government. The reason is that Pugachev did not create the fire. He walked into a landscape soaked in oil and dropped a match. The Yaik Cossacks were in open resentment over the loss of their old liberties. The Bashkirs, a Turkic Muslim people of the southern Urals, had been rising against Russian encroachment for decades and had been put down with great brutality. The peasants assigned to the ironworks and mines of the Urals, tens of thousands of them, worked in conditions that killed men young. Old believers across the region hated the state church. The nomadic Kalmyks and Kazakhs had grievances of their own. And beyond all these particular angers lay the enormous, patient, universal fury of the Russian serf. Pugachev's manifestos are the key to the whole thing. He was illiterate and dictated them to secretaries, and they read like nothing else in Russian history until 1917. He granted the people, in the name of the emperor, the land and the waters and the forests and the fisheries, freedom from recruitment and from the poll tax, the right to their own faith, and their own beards and their own dress, and the ancient Cossack liberties. And he told them to hang the nobles. They did. That is the part that Catherine never forgot. The rising was not a demonstration. In the provinces of Kazan, Orenburg, Nizhny Novgorod, and Penza, serfs turned on their landlords and killed them, and their wives and their children in the manor houses with axes and fire. Perhaps 3,000 nobles and officials died that way, along with priests who preached obedience and any officer who fell into rebel hands. The estates burned. In the towns that opened their gates, the garrison officers were hanged from the walls. The government response was slow and clumsy. At first, because the best troops and the best generals were on the Danube fighting the Turks. Pugachev besieged Orenburg through the winter of 1773 and 1774, failed to take it, was beaten by a relief force, and reappeared. He was beaten again and reappeared again. In July of 1774, he took Kazan, one of the great cities of the Middle Volga, and burned most of it, though the citadel held out. Catherine, in Petersburg, was more frightened than she ever admitted in public, and more decisive than her enemies expected. She called him the Marquis of Pugachev in her letters to Voltaire, laughing it off as brigandage, and simultaneously she poured troops eastward the moment the Turkish peace was signed, put Rumyantsev's best subordinates in command, and offered a reward for the impostor that grew until it was enormous. She also quietly offered to go herself to Moscow to steady the country, and had to be talked out of it. The end came quickly once the regular army arrived in force. Pugachev was smashed near Tsaritsyn in August of 1774. He fled east across the steppe with a few hundred men, and his own Cossack officers, seeing that it was finished and hoping to save themselves, seized him, tied him up, and handed him over. He was brought to Moscow in an iron cage on a cart, so that the crowds could see that the Emperor Peter III was a Cossack deserter after all. He was interrogated at length. He answered everything. On a January morning in 1775, he was taken to a square in Moscow and beheaded, and the executioner had discreet orders to kill him with the axe before the rest of the sentence was carried out, which was a mercy of a kind that the 18th century considered notable. Thousands of his followers were flogged, branded, mutilated, and exiled. Along the rivers, bodies were hung on rafts and floated downstream past the villages as a warning. Catherine tried to erase him. The river Yaik was renamed the Ural. The Yaik Cossack host was renamed. Pugachev's home village was burned and rebuilt on another site under another name. It was forbidden to speak of him. In the same spirit, she never again spoke publicly about reforming serfdom. That is the true and lasting consequence of the rising. Before 1773, Catherine had been an autocrat who dreamed of liberalizing. After 1773, she was an autocrat who dreamed of order. The provincial reform of 1775 came directly out of the rebellion, because what the crisis had exposed was not cruelty but absence, an empire in which whole provinces contained almost no government at all. She built the administrative machine so that nothing like this could ever get so far again, and the nobility, who had watched their cousins hacked to death in their own halls, closed ranks around her, and the bargain of her reign was sealed in blood. In the middle of that terrible year, the Empress fell in love, and it was the most important thing that ever happened to her. Grigory Potemkin had been in her life, at the edges, for 12 years. He had been a young sergeant of the Horse Guards on the day of the coup in 1762, and there is a story, probably true, that when she found herself without a sword knot on her borrowed uniform, he rode forward and gave her his own, and that his horse then refused to leave hers and had to be pulled away, and that she remembered him for it. He was not a conventional courtier. He came from the middling gentry of Smolensk, was educated at Moscow University, and expelled from it for idleness, and had spent his youth oscillating wildly between wild parties and periods of intense religious brooding in which he talked seriously of becoming a monk. He was very tall and had been very handsome until he lost the sight of one eye, probably through illness and possibly through a beating from the Orlov brothers, after which he hid himself away for a year and a half in a darkened room, convinced he was ruined. He was, by every account, the most extraordinary personality of the reign. Brilliant, lazy, generous, moody, superstitious, extravagant beyond all reason. He could lie on a sofa in a dressing gown for a fortnight, biting his nails and reading theology, and then work for 3 days without sleep and produce a plan for the settlement of a province. He collected jewels and played with them by the handful. He built palaces and lost interest in them half-finished. He knew the whole Orthodox liturgy by heart and could sing it. He had a temper and enormous charm, and he made Catherine laugh more than anyone else ever did. In the winter of 1774, with Pugachev still loose on the Volga, she summoned him from the Turkish front. Within weeks they were lovers. Within months she was writing him notes several times a day, sometimes several times an hour, and those notes survive, and they are almost unbearably human. A woman of 45, the ruler of the largest country on earth, writing to a man of 35, calling him her golden pheasant, her tiger, her twin soul, her dearest husband, telling him she cannot go 2 hours without wanting to know what he thinks, apologizing for a quarrel, teasing him about his moods, her dearest husband. That phrase, and a dozen others like it, is the reason most historians now believe that in 1774 or thereabouts Catherine and Potemkin were secretly married in a night ceremony in a church in Moscow or Petersburg. There is no surviving certificate. There is a mass of circumstantial evidence, including the language of the letters, the behavior of the couple, the reports of foreign envoys, and a family tradition that the ring was preserved. It cannot be proved. Most who have studied the letters closely come away convinced the passion burned very hot and, in the way of such things, burned down within about 2 years. They quarreled violently, reconciled, quarreled again. By 1776 they were no longer lovers, and then something almost unheard of happened. They stayed together anyway. For the next 17 years, until his death, Potemkin was her partner in governing the empire. He remained the second person in Russia, made and unmade ministers, commanded armies, founded cities, and could walk into her private rooms unannounced at any hour in a dressing gown. He also, notoriously, took a hand in selecting her later lovers, who were young officers installed in an apartment beneath hers and given titles and estates, and, when they were dismissed, spectacular pensions. That arrangement scandalized Europe and gave the pamphleteers everything they needed, and the filthiest legends about Catherine grew out of it, including the grotesque story about a horse which was invented after her death by people who wanted a monster and could not find one. What the arrangement really was, underneath the gossip, was 2 people who had found in each other the only equal either of them ever met, and who had the sense not to throw it away when the fever passed. Together they were about to do something enormous. The south of Russia in 1775 was very nearly empty. Between the settled lands of the Ukraine and the Black Sea lay a huge belt of open steppe, grass to the horizon, crossed by a few rivers and used for centuries as a raiding corridor by Tatar horsemen. There were almost no towns. There was no port. It was the frontier that had bled Russia for 300 years. Catherine gave it to Potemkin, and he called it New Russia, and he set about filling it. What he did there in 15 years is one of the great colonizing efforts of the century, and it was done with a mixture of vision, corruption, ruthlessness, and improvisation that is entirely characteristic of the man. He offered land and exemption from taxes to anyone who would come. Runaway serfs, if they got that far, were quietly not returned. Old believers were promised religious freedom. He recruited German farmers, Greeks fleeing Ottoman rule, Bulgarians, Serbs, Armenians, Moldavians, Jews, Corsicans, and Italians. He brought in English gardeners and sheep from Spain and vines from France. He founded cities out of nothing and named them in a fit of classical enthusiasm. Kherson on the lower Dnieper, with a shipyard to build a Black Sea fleet. Nikolaev, Yekaterinoslav, meaning the glory of Catherine, where he planned a cathedral longer than St. Peter's in Rome and a university and a conservatoire, most of which never happened. And in 1778 he founded a port at a place the Tatars called Hasibey, which within a generation became Odessa. He also dissolved the Zaporozhian Cossack host, the famous fortified island community on the Dnieper Rapids, whose independence no longer had a purpose now that the frontier had moved past them, and whose habits of self-government were incompatible with the new order. Some went to serve the Sultan. Most were resettled on the Kuban and became the Black Sea Cossacks. It was a small extinction, and it barely registered at the time, and it is a reminder that every one of these achievements was built over somebody. The prize at the center of the whole design was the Crimea. The peninsula had been declared independent in 1774. Independence in practice meant that a Russian-backed Khan sat in the palace at Bakhchisarai while his subjects loathed him, and the Ottomans intrigued, and there were risings, and Russian troops kept having to restore order. It could not last, and everyone knew what it was waiting for. In April of 1783, Catherine signed a manifesto annexing the Crimea, the Taman Peninsula, and the Kuban to the Russian Empire. The Khan was pensioned off. There was very little fighting. Potemkin traveled through the peninsula, receiving oaths of allegiance from the Tatar nobility, guaranteeing them the status of Russian nobles and promising the population religious freedom, which was on the whole honored, at least at first. Many thousands of Tatars emigrated to Ottoman lands over the following years, some by choice, some under pressure. Russia now had the north coast of the Black Sea and a base at a magnificent natural harbor on the southwestern tip of the Crimea, which Catherine named Sevastopol, meaning the August City, and where the Black Sea Fleet was born. Behind all this lay a dream she and Potemkin talked about for years, which they called the Greek Project. It was nothing less than the destruction of the Ottoman Empire in Europe, the recapture of Constantinople, and the restoration of a Christian Byzantine empire there under a Russian prince. This was not entirely a fantasy in their minds. She had her second grandson christened Constantine, gave him a Greek nurse, and had a medal struck showing the Church of Hagia Sophia. She sounded out the Austrians about a partition. It never came close to happening. But it explains why the wars in the South had a religious and almost mystical intensity for her that the wars in Poland never had. In 1787, she went to see what her partner had built, and the journey became the most famous progress of the century. She left St. Petersburg in January with a train of 14 carriages and 124 sledges, traveling south through the snow with an entourage of ambassadors and courtiers. In the spring at Kiev, the party transferred to a fleet of galleys painted red and gold and floated down the Dnieper, with musicians aboard and cannon firing salutes from the banks. The journey lasted 6 months and covered some 4,000 miles. Along the way, she was joined by the Emperor Joseph II of Austria, traveling incognito as Count Falkenstein, and by the Polish king Stanislaw Poniatowski, who was the same Stanislaw who had been her lover 30 years earlier and whom she had since placed on the Polish throne. That meeting is one of the sadder small scenes of the story. He came aboard, spent a few hours with her, was polite and hopeful, wanted an alliance and an army and a future for his country, and got nothing but courtesy. He asked at the end if she remembered him. She gave him her hand. The party saw new towns with fresh whitewashed buildings, fleets riding at anchor at Sevastopol, squadrons of Tatar cavalry escorting the Empress through the Crimean hills, Cossacks maneuvering on the steppe, illuminations, arches, fireworks, and crowds of settlers in new villages waving as the galleys went past. And out of that journey came the phrase that has attached itself to Potemkin's name forever. The story of the Potemkin villages, that he built painted facades of houses on rollers and moved them along the riverbank ahead of the Empress, populated them with peasants driven from elsewhere, and herded them downstream to appear again the next day, comes almost entirely from a hostile Saxon diplomat who was not present and who disliked Potemkin intensely, and from the gossip of courtiers who resented his power. The truth is more interesting than the legend. Potemkin did stage-manage the tour thoroughly and expensively. He had villages tidied and painted, moved herds of cattle to graze in view, and arranged everything to be seen at its best moment from the water. Any government in the world would do the same for a state visit, but the towns were real. Kherson had a shipyard and warships. Sevastopol had a fleet, and the foreign ambassadors aboard the galleys saw it and reported it home, and one of them wrote that the sight of a Russian battle fleet in the Black Sea was worth more than any speech. The settlers were real, though fewer and poorer than the display suggested. The achievement was genuine, and it was also exaggerated, and the exaggeration was later mistaken for the whole. The tour had one further consequence, and it was not the one intended. The Ottoman government watched the Empress of Russia parade through territory taken from them 4 years earlier, watched her pass under an arch at Kherson, which was inscribed with the words, "This is the way to Constantinople," and drew the obvious conclusion. In August of 1787, the Turks declared war. The Second Russo-Turkish War lasted 4 years and was harder than the first, because this time the Ottomans had reformed something, and Russia was fighting on 2 fronts. Sweden, seeing Russia occupied in the south, attacked in the north in 1788 and got close enough to St. Petersburg that the guns could be heard in the city, and Catherine, 60 years old, stood at a window listening to them and refused to leave. In the south, 2 names emerged. The first was Potemkin himself, who commanded in chief and who was, as a soldier, cautious and slow and much criticized, and who nonetheless took the great fortress of Ochakov in December of 1788, after a siege of 6 months, in a storm at temperatures far below freezing, in one of the bloodiest assaults of the century. The second was Alexander Suvorov, and he was something else entirely. Suvorov was a small, thin, eccentric, ugly man who slept on straw, ate with his soldiers, crowed like a rooster when he was pleased, and never lost a battle in his life. He believed in speed, the bayonet, and the morale of the common soldier, and he wrote a training manual whose principles were a century ahead of their time. At Rymnik in 1789, he destroyed an Ottoman army 4 times the size of his own force. In December of 1790, he stormed the fortress of Izmail on the Danube, which was considered impregnable and which had a garrison of 35,000 men, in a single day of the most savage fighting imaginable. Almost the entire garrison died. So did a great many civilians in the town afterwards, over 3 days that even hardened soldiers described with horror. The war ended in 1792 with the Treaty of Jassy, which confirmed the annexation of the Crimea and pushed the Russian frontier to the river Dniester. But Potemkin did not live to see the treaty signed. He had been ill for a long time, worn out by fever and overwork and enormous living. In the autumn of 1791, he left Jassy in a carriage, trying to reach Nikolaev, saying that he could not breathe in the town and wanted the open steppe. A few miles out, he made them stop and lift him down, and he was laid on a carpet spread on the grass by the roadside, and he died there in the open air on the 5th of October, in his 52nd year, with a Cossack holding his head. They sent the news north. Catherine read it and fainted and had to be bled, and then wept for days. She wrote to her friend Grimm that there was no longer anyone she could rely on, that her pupil, her friend, almost her idol, was gone, and that she did not know how she was to replace him. She said that he had one quality above all others, that he had courage in his heart and in his head and in his soul, and that they had never disagreed for more than a week without one of them coming back. She was 62. She would live another 5 years, and she would never find anybody remotely like him again. We have to go back now and follow the other great thread of her foreign policy, which is the one that has done most damage to her reputation and which she herself regarded as ordinary statecraft. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the 18th century was a very large country and a very weak one, and the reason was written into its constitution. It was a republic with an elected king, and the electors were the Szlachta, the noble class, who made up a far larger share of the population than the nobility of any other European country. Every one of them, in theory, was equal to every other, and in the parliament the same. Any single deputy could kill any measure by rising and objecting, under a rule called the liberum veto, which meant literally the free veto. Once invoked, it did not merely stop the bill. It dissolved the entire session and annulled everything already passed. Between 1652 and 1764, something like a third of all parliamentary sessions were destroyed in this way, many of them by deputies bribed by foreign embassies. A country that cannot pass a law cannot raise a tax, and a country that cannot raise a tax cannot keep an army. By the middle of the century, Poland had perhaps 12,000 soldiers on paper in a state of 200,000 square miles, surrounded by 3 of the most militarized monarchies in Europe. It was, in a phrase used at the time, an inn with open doors. In 1763, the Polish king died, and Catherine, who had been on her own throne for a year, moved to install a successor. Her choice was Stanislaw Poniatowski, her old lover, now 32 years old, cultivated, patriotic and pliable, or so she believed. Russian troops moved into the neighborhood of the election field. He was chosen in 1764. Frederick of Prussia agreed to it in advance. The plan was not to conquer Poland. The plan was to keep Poland exactly as it was, weak and open, as a permanent buffer and client. Catherine and Frederick jointly guaranteed the Polish constitution, including the liberum veto, precisely because it kept the country paralyzed. It is one of the great cynical acts of the century, 2 absolute monarchs defending another nation's liberties in order to ensure that it could never defend itself. Then Stanislaw did what she had not expected. He tried to reform his country. He gathered around him men who wanted to abolish the veto, build an army, reorganize the finances, and drag Poland into the modern age. Catherine blocked it. She also pushed hard, in the name of religious toleration, for full political rights for the Orthodox and Protestant minorities in Poland, which was in itself a perfectly enlightened demand, and which in her hands was a crowbar, because it gave Russia a permanent right to intervene on behalf of Polish subjects against their own government. In 1768, a group of Catholic nobles formed an armed confederation at Bar to resist Russian domination, and civil war began, and it dragged on for 4 years and drew the Ottomans in, which is how the First Turkish War started. By 1772, the whole region was unstable, and Frederick of Prussia proposed a solution of magnificent simplicity. If Russia, Prussia, and Austria each took a slice of Poland, then none of them would gain an advantage over the others, and the crisis would be resolved. Russia would be compensated for her Turkish war without alarming Vienna. Everyone would profit and nobody would fight. Catherine agreed. Maria Theresa of Austria wept over it and signed anyway, which provoked Frederick's famous remark that she wept and she took. Poland lost about 1/3 of its territory and 1/3 of its people. The Polish parliament was compelled, under the guns of foreign troops, to ratify the loss. 20 years later, the second partition came, and it came because the Poles nearly saved themselves. In 1791, while Russia was fighting the Turks and Europe was distracted by the revolution in France, the Polish Sejm passed a new constitution. It abolished the liberum veto, made the monarchy hereditary, created a proper executive, extended protection to the towns, and some rights to the peasantry. It was signed on the 3rd of May, and it was the first written constitution in Europe, and the second in the world after the American one. And it was moderate, sensible, and long overdue. Catherine called it a Jacobin conspiracy. That is the point at which one has to be honest about what had happened to her. The woman who had corresponded with Voltaire for 15 years described a limited monarchy on her border as the contagion of the French disease. She said in private that she was fighting Jacobinism in Warsaw. And in 1792, the Turkish War having ended, she sent an army into Poland at the invitation of a handful of reactionary Polish magnates who had formed a confederation at Targowica to overturn the constitution. The Poles fought and lost. The constitution was annulled. In 1793, Russia and Prussia took another enormous bite, and the Rump Sejm was forced to approve it in a session in which the deputies simply sat in silence, refusing to speak, until the presiding officer ruled that silence gave consent. And then in 1794, Poland rose. The leader was Tadeusz Kosciuszko, who had spent 7 years in America fighting in the Revolutionary War, had built the fortifications at West Point, and had come home to find his country being dismembered. He raised the standard in Krakow in March, promised freedom to any peasant who took up arms, and beat a Russian force at Raklowice with a corps of peasants armed with scythes straightened into pikes. Warsaw rose and drove out the Russian garrison. Vilnius rose. For a few months, an improvised national army held off 2 empires. It could not last. Prussia and Russia converged. Kosciuszko was wounded and captured at Maciejowice in October. And in November, Suvorov stormed the Warsaw suburb of Praga, and the assault turned into a massacre in which many thousands of civilians died, and Warsaw surrendered the next day rather than see the same thing on the other bank of the river. In 1795, the 3 powers divided what was left. Stanislaw was made to abdicate and was taken to Russia, where he lived on a pension in St. Petersburg and died in 1798, having outlived both his kingdom and the woman who had made and unmade him. Poland ceased to exist. It would not appear on the map again for 123 years. Catherine took the largest share of the territory, though it was mostly land with Belarusian, Lithuanian and Ukrainian populations, rather than ethnic Polish heartland, which went to Prussia and Austria. She always insisted that she had annexed no Polish land at all, only recovered ancient Russian provinces, and she had a medal struck saying so. It was a lawyer's argument, and it was also how she genuinely saw it. To Poles, it is the founding catastrophe of their modern history, and Catherine's name in Poland means something very close to what a conqueror's name means anywhere. To her, it was a piece of routine 18th century statecraft in which three powers had adjusted a frontier by agreement rather than by war. Both of these things are true at once, and the second does not excuse the first. Meanwhile, the world she had grown up in was ending. In July of 1789, a crowd in Paris took the Bastille. Catherine, at first, was not greatly alarmed. She had never much liked Louis XVI, whom she considered weak, and she rather enjoyed the discomfiture of the French court. She made jokes about it. The jokes stopped as the news got worse. When the royal family were caught fleeing at Varennes, she began to speak of the revolution as a plague. In January of 1793, Louis was executed. Catherine took to her bed for a week, genuinely ill with shock. She broke off diplomatic relations, expelled the French charge d'affaires, banned French ships from Russian ports, required every French subject in Russia to swear an oath repudiating the revolution or leave, and had the busts of Voltaire removed from her galleries. That last detail is the one that says everything. She had spent 30 years telling Europe that reason and philosophy would perfect mankind. Now she watched philosophy walk into the public square in Paris and cut a king's head off, and she went and took her old friend's marble face off its pedestal and put it in a storeroom. The hardening had begun some years earlier, and it fell on two Russians in particular. Nikolai Novikov was a publisher, and by any measure one of the most useful men in the empire. He printed books at a rate nobody in Russia had matched, ran journals, founded lending libraries and a free school and a hospital dispensary, and organized famine relief in the Moscow region that certainly saved lives. He was also a Freemason, and Freemasonry in Russia in the 1780s had become, in Catherine's mind, a network of secret associations with foreign connections and links to her son Paul. In 1792, Novikov was arrested, questioned, and shut up in the fortress of Schlüsselburg for 15 years without a public trial. He served 4 and was released only when Catherine died. Alexander Radishchev was worse, from her point of view, because he had been educated at her expense. In 1790, he published, at his own small press, a book called A Journey from St. Petersburg to Moscow. It is written as a traveler's account of stops along the road, and at each stop the narrator encounters something. A peasant plowing on a Sunday because it is the only day he can work his own strip. A family being sold at auction, the old man who had saved his master's life, the young woman about to be bought by a man everyone understands will use her, recruits being taken away, a landowner's sons who rape a village girl. It is uneven and sentimental, and it is also the first sustained attack on serfdom ever published in Russia, and it says plainly that the system is a crime, and that if nothing changes, the peasants will rise and will be right too. Catherine read it, with a pencil in her hand, and her marginal notes survive. She wrote that the author was a rebel worse than Pugachev. She wrote that he was infected with the French madness. He was arrested, tried, and sentenced to death. She commuted the sentence to 10 years' exile in Siberia, which was, in the ghastly arithmetic of the time, mercy. Here is the thing that should be said plainly. Almost everything Radishchev wrote in that book about serfdom, Catherine herself had written 30 years earlier in the drafts of the Nakaz, and had allowed to be cut. He said aloud, in print, to the public, the thing she had said privately to herself as a young woman, and she sent him to Siberia for it. She was 61 years old and had ruled for 28 years. She had built a machine that worked, and she had become the thing the machine required. It is worth stopping here before we go back to the palace and looking out at the country itself, because the Russia over which she presided was not really one country at all. Travel was the thing that shaped everything. The empire ran for 6,000 miles from the Baltic to the Pacific, and there were almost no hard roads in any of it. In summer, the great post roads were dust and ruts, and a carriage could be shaken to pieces on them. In spring and autumn came the Rasputitsa, the season of bad roads, when the thaw or the rains turned the whole surface of the country into mud so deep that wheels sank to the axle and movement simply stopped for weeks. Villages were cut off, post riders waited, governors stopped receiving orders, and then in November the ground froze and Russia came alive. Winter was the traveling season. Once the frost was hard, the mud became iron and the snow lay smooth over it, and the rivers which in summer were obstacles became roads. Sledges ran day and night, gliding on packed snow at speeds no carriage could match on the best highway in France. Goods that had waited all autumn moved in a few weeks. Peasants who had nothing to do in the fields hired themselves out with their horses as carters. A merchant could go from Moscow to Petersburg in 3 days if he changed horses often and did not mind the cold. Foreign visitors were astonished to discover that the most inaccessible country in Europe became for 4 months a year one of the easiest to cross. The cold itself was of a different order from anything a Western European had experienced. Travelers wrote about the way the air burned in the nose, about breath freezing on fur collars, about the deep blue of shadows on snow at noon, and the enormous silence of a forest at 30 degrees below. In the country, the peasants lived in log houses called izbas, low buildings of squared pine with tiny windows, built around an enormous whitewashed stove that took up a quarter of the room. The whole family slept on and around that stove, and the animals sometimes came inside, and it was warm and dark and smoky, and it kept people alive. The peasant year had a shape that had not changed in centuries and would not change for another century after. Sowing in May, once the ground had dried. Haymaking at midsummer, when the northern nights barely darken and men worked until 9 or 10 in the evening. Harvest in August, the frantic weeks when a family worked the master's strips and then their own by lamplight. Then threshing in barns, and the flax and the hemp, and the long slide into the dark. Winter was for indoor work and for weddings, because there was time. It was also the season of the great fairs, and the greatest of them was at Makarev on the Volga, later moved to Nizhny Novgorod, where for a few weeks each year tens of thousands of people came from every direction to trade. Persian silk and Chinese tea came up from the south and east. Furs came down from Siberia, sable and ermine and fox, brought by hunters and by tribute collectors from peoples whose names most Russians had never heard. Iron from the Urals, saltfish, honey, wax, tallow, hides, timber, hemp and flax, which the British Navy bought by the shipload, because Russian hemp made the best rope in the world. Above all, there was grain, and by the end of her reign, the grain had somewhere new to go. Before the conquest of the Black Sea coast, Russian wheat had to travel enormous distances overland or take the long northern route out of the Baltic. Afterwards it went down the rivers to Kherson and Odessa, and out through the straits, and the black earth of the south, which is some of the richest soil on the planet, began to be plowed in earnest. The cities were 3 different worlds. St. Petersburg was the newest and strangest. It had been standing for less than a century, and it looked like nowhere else in Russia and rather like an idea of Amsterdam and Rome dropped onto a marsh. Straight streets, canals, Baroque, and then, under Catherine's influence, neoclassical facades in ochre and pale green and white. She hated Baroque and loved the clean lines of the ancients, and she brought in architects from Scotland and Italy and set them to work. It was a city of granite embankments and pale summer nights, and enormous winter fogs, of French spoken in the drawing rooms and Russian in the yards, of noble palaces with 50 servants and, 3 streets away, wooden houses where the same families had lived before the city existed. Moscow was the opposite. It was old, sprawling, wooden, and profoundly Russian, a city of hundreds of churches whose bells on a feast day made a sound visitors never forgot. It burned regularly and was rebuilt. Its nobility were the ones who did not go to court, retired officers and old families who kept enormous households and hundreds of serfs and lived, by Petersburg standards, like provincial kings. Catherine never much liked Moscow and said it was a place of idleness and superstition, and she went there when she had to. And then there were the provincial towns, which, after her reform of 1775, all began to look the same, because she sent them standard plans. A square, a governor's house, a treasury, a court, a jail, a church, a school after 1786, a fire station. 50 of these little administrative capitals were pressed into the landscape, like seals into wax. And in most of them the mud came up to the boot tops, and pigs walked in the main street. And yet the paperwork went out and came back, and that was the point. Beyond all this lay the parts of the empire that were not Russian at all, and Catherine's approach to them was as pragmatic as everything else about her. Her subjects included Lutheran Germans in the Baltic provinces with their own law and their own guilds, Muslim Tatars in the Crimea and on the Volga, Buddhist Kalmyks, Jews in the newly annexed Polish lands who were granted rights they had not previously had in Russia, and then confined by degrees to a defined area of settlement, Cossack hosts with old privileges, and Siberian peoples who paid their tax in furs. She was genuinely tolerant by the standards of her century, permitting mosques to be built and endowing an assembly for Muslim clergy, and she was tolerant in the way a good administrator is tolerant, because persecution is expensive and unrest costs money. This was the country, vast, cold, mostly illiterate, moving at the speed of a horse for 8 months a year, and the speed of a sledge for 4, held together by rivers, and a thin net of officials, and an enormous amount of habit. And in a warm room at the top of a palace on the Neva, an old woman got up at 5 in the morning to write to it. Let us come back for a while, from the frontiers and the treaties, and look at how she actually lived, because the private life of Catherine has been buried under more nonsense than almost any other subject in European history. Her days were extraordinarily regular. She woke between 5 and 6, in a plain room, and lit the fire herself if the servant had not come, and made her own coffee in a small pot. It was famously strong, 1 pound of coffee to 5 cups by one account, and the greyhounds got the grounds with cream. Then she sat down at her desk in a loose morning gown, with a cap on her head, and wrote until 9, alone, with the dogs asleep around her feet, and a little Japanese screen behind her chair. She wrote constant decrees, memoranda, notes to ministers, instructions to generals, letters to Voltaire and to Grimm and to Potemkin, and for pleasure, comedies and satires and children's stories for her grandsons, and a history of Russia, and a set of memoirs that she rewrote 3 times and never finished. She wrote quickly and untidily in 3 languages, none of them perfectly. Her Russian spelling was atrocious to the end of her life, and she knew it and did not much care, saying that she wrote to be understood. At 9 she was available. Ministers came in one at a time with their portfolios. She heard them, questioned them, decided. The Russian system had no cabinet and no prime minister, and everything of any importance came to the desk of one woman, then court dress, and the public part of the day, and dinner in the early afternoon, which was plain by the standards of the age. She was not much interested in food. She liked boiled beef with pickled cucumber and gooseberry water, and she drank very little wine, which in that court made her nearly unique. In the evening there were what she called the small hermitage parties, and these are the most likable thing about her. She hung rules on the wall of the room in her own words. Leave your rank at the door, along with your hat and your sword. Do not sit while others stand. Speak moderately, so that others do not get a headache. Argue without heat. Do not sigh or yawn. Do not tell tales out of the room. Anyone who breaks a rule pays a forfeit, and anyone who breaks all of them is banished from the gatherings forever. They played charades and word games and cards for small stakes, and she permitted herself to be laughed at, which no other sovereign in Europe did. She had 10 favorites over the course of her life, or 12 depending on how you count, and this is the source of the entire scandalous legend. The pattern once established was consistent. A handsome young officer, usually in his 20s, usually chosen for looks and manners rather than for ability, was appointed adjutant general, given the apartment directly below hers, connected by a private stair, and installed with a large initial gift. He accompanied her, was expected to be agreeable, was watched by the entire court, and when it ended, as it always did, he was dismissed with an estate, a title, a pension, and often several thousand serfs, and he generally went away rich and unresentful. Some of them were absurd, some were pleasant nonentities. 2 of them mattered. Alexander Lanskoy was 22 when she was 50, and he seems to have been the gentlest attachment of her life. He was not ambitious, did not meddle, collected books and paintings with her, and was learning to be an educated man under her direction. In 1784, he died of a fever after 5 days, and Catherine collapsed completely. She did not leave her rooms for weeks, could not eat, could not stop crying, told Grimm that she had become a desperate creature who could not put 2 words together, and that her happiness was gone. Potemkin came back from the south, forced his way in, and sat with her, and eventually got her out of the room. It is the only time in 34 years that the machinery of her government stopped. Platon Zubov was the last and the worst. He was 22 when he came to her in 1789. She was 60, and unlike the others, Zubov was ambitious, greedy, and stupid. And after Potemkin's death in 1791, there was nobody left with the standing to keep him in his place. He accumulated offices and orders, ran a court within the court, made foreign policy suggestions of remarkable foolishness, and treated ministers with contempt while they stood in his antechamber and waited. The old Empress, who had never in her life been fooled by anybody, was fooled by him, or perhaps was simply too tired at the end to care. That is the true story of Catherine's favorites, and it is a story of a woman who could not be alone. She said so herself, more than once in her letters. She wrote that she could not live a day without love, and that the whole trouble was that her heart would not be content without occupation for a single hour. Read alongside the childhood. It is not difficult to understand. What Europe made of it is another matter. Because she was a woman, behavior that would have gone almost unremarked in a king became an obsession. Louis XV of France had far more mistresses and an official department to manage them. Nobody wrote pamphlets calling him a monster. Catherine had 10 lovers over 34 years, all of them adults, all of them well rewarded. And by the time she had been dead 10 years, the French and English presses had turned her into a devouring ogress with a nightly appetite for guardsmen. The story about the horse, which is the one everybody has heard, has no source at all in her lifetime. It appears decades after her death, in nothing better than gossip, and it was very probably invented by French aristocratic exiles who hated her for the partitions of Poland, or by the sort of people who find the idea of a powerful old woman unbearable. She died in bed, of a stroke, and the manner of her death was witnessed by servants and doctors, and recorded in detail, and there is nothing mysterious about it at all. The relationship that really damaged her, and the one that mattered for the future of Russia, was with her son. Paul was 30 when Potemkin was at the height of his power, and he had nothing to do. His mother had taken his upbringing from him, taken his throne, in his view, from him, and now gave him no employment. He was not permitted to sit on the council, was not given a command in either Turkish war, and was kept away from anything of substance. She thought him unbalanced, and she was not entirely wrong, and her treatment of him made it worse every year. He married twice. His first wife died in childbirth, and Catherine, with brutal efficiency, showed him the dead woman's love letters to his best friend, and had him remarried within months. His second wife, a German princess renamed Maria Fyodorovna, was a sensible and fertile woman who gave him 10 children. And when the first of those children was born in 1777, Catherine did to Paul exactly what Elizabeth had done to her. She took the baby. Alexander was carried off to the Empress's own apartments and raised by her. So was his brother Constantine, born 2 years later. Catherine adored them. She wrote a special alphabet for Alexander, designed his clothing on rational principles with no tight collars, insisted on cold baths and open windows and sleeping on hard mattresses, chose a Swiss Republican named La Harpe as his tutor, and set out to grow a philosopher king. She wrote to Grimm about the boy for years, with the delight of a woman who is being given a second chance at motherhood. Paul, meanwhile, retreated to an estate at Gatchina and built a miniature Prussian world there, with his own small army in Prussian uniforms drilling on a parade ground, guardhouses, striped barriers, and a routine of parades and inspections. It is unbearable to notice, but impossible not to, that he had become his father almost exactly. The court called Gatchina his toy kingdom and laughed at it, and he knew. By the middle of the 1790s, Catherine had decided to disinherit him. She intended to pass the throne directly to Alexander, and she prepared the ground, sounded out ministers, and drafted a manifesto. Alexander, who was 19 and loved his grandmother and feared his father, and had learned from both of them to say what each wanted to hear, gave her an answer that committed him to nothing. She kept postponing the announcement. She was going to make it in the autumn of 1796, or the following January, or at some point when the moment was right. She left it too long. The last 2 years were not kind to her. She was in her 60s, and she had grown very heavy. Her legs were swollen and ulcerated, and she could no longer manage stairs, so a ramp was built at Tsarskoye Selo so that she could be carried up in a chair. She had lost most of her teeth, which changed the shape of her face and made her speech indistinct. She had headaches and rheumatism, and, in the mornings especially, a leaden fatigue that she had never known. She kept the routine anyway: the fire, the coffee, the desk, the greyhounds, the ministers at 9. She still worked more hours a day than most of the young men around her. But the mind that had once turned over Montesquieu at 5 in the morning was now spending a great deal of its energy simply on the machinery of holding on. And around her the world had gone wrong. Potemkin was dead. Voltaire was dead, and his bust was in a storeroom. Diderot was dead. Grimm, her old correspondent, was a refugee. France was a republic that had killed its king and queen, and was now sending armies across Europe under generals nobody had heard of, including a very young Corsican who had just done something remarkable in Italy. The enlightenment she had spent her life inside had produced, at its end, the guillotine, and she had no idea what to make of that, and never worked it out. Her last diplomatic project was a small domestic humiliation. She had arranged a marriage between her granddaughter Alexandra and the young King of Sweden, and in September of 1796, the Swedish party came to Petersburg for the betrothal. On the appointed evening, the whole court assembled in the throne room, the Empress in full state, the bride in her jewels, the treaty ready. The king did not come. He had discovered a clause about the girl keeping her orthodox religion, and he refused to sign, and he sat in his lodgings and would not move. Catherine waited in front of her entire court for hours. Eventually, the assembly was dismissed. That night, or shortly after, she had a small stroke, which was hushed up. She recovered enough to go on working. She was making plans for the following spring. She wrote to Grimm on the 4th of November, cheerfully, about nothing very much. On the morning of the 5th of November in 1796, she rose as usual, drank her coffee, worked at her papers, and spoke to her secretary. At about 9, she went into her dressing room and did not come out. Her valet, growing uneasy after some time, opened the door and found her on the floor, unconscious, her face darkened, breathing with difficulty. She was too heavy for the servants to lift onto the bed, so they laid a mattress on the floor of the bedroom and moved her onto that, and there she stayed. She never regained consciousness. The doctors bled her and applied blisters and could do nothing at all. She had suffered a massive stroke. She lay on the mattress on the floor through that day and that night, and the whole of the following day, breathing heavily, while the palace filled with people. Paul was fetched from Gatchina and arrived in the afternoon. He went into the room, looked at his mother, and then went to her study and began going through her papers with a trusted companion and burned a quantity of them in the fireplace. What was in them has been argued about ever since. Almost certainly the manifesto disinheriting him. Possibly the letter from Alexei Orlov about Ropsha. Possibly nothing of the kind. He said nothing about it then or afterwards. At about 9:45 on the evening of the 6th of November, Catherine II died on a mattress on the floor of her bedroom in the Winter Palace, in the 68th year of her life and the 35th of her reign. Paul became emperor at once, and his first acts tell you everything about the 42 years he had spent waiting. He had his father's body brought up from the monastery where it had lain for 34 years. The coffin was opened. There was almost nothing left of Peter III but bones and a hat and some pieces of cloth. Paul had the remains crowned, formally with an imperial crown, so that the man who had never been crowned in life was crowned in death. Then he had the coffin carried in state through St. Petersburg to lie beside his mother's, and he ordered the surviving men of 1762, the old Orlov brother among them, to walk in the procession and carry the crown and the regalia behind the coffin of the man they had overthrown. They were elderly now. They walked. The two coffins were buried together in the cathedral of the Peter and Paul fortress, with the same date of burial and different dates of death, so that anyone reading the stones would understand that the marriage had been restored by his authority. Then he set about undoing his mother. He released Novikov from his fortress and Radishchev from Siberia. He restored Kosciuszko and let him go abroad. He also introduced a law of succession on the day of his own coronation, fixing it strictly on the male line by primogeniture, so that no woman could ever again take the throne of Russia as his mother had. He reversed her military reforms, put the army back into Prussian uniforms and powdered wigs, drilled everybody mercilessly, and made himself so hated in 5 years that in 1801 a group of officers walked into his bedroom in the middle of the night and murdered him. With the tacit knowledge of his son Alexander, who then reigned for 1/4 of a century and defeated Napoleon. The pattern she had lived by outlived her exactly. So what is the account at the end? The measurable part is easy. In 34 years, Russia's territory grew by some 200,000 square miles. The population rose from around 19 million to around 37 million, partly by conquest and partly by growth. State revenues quadrupled. The army grew from about 300,000 to 500,000. The Black Sea, which had been an Ottoman lake, became a Russian coastline with a fleet and ports, and the grain of the Ukraine began to flow out through Odessa to feed Europe, which it did for the next 150 years. Russia entered her reign as a great power on probation and left it as the arbiter of Eastern Europe, and no serious question about the continent could be settled without her for the next century. She founded or refounded something like 140 towns. She built the Hermitage. She gave St. Petersburg its granite embankments along the Neva, which are still there, and the bronze horsemen of Peter the Great on its enormous rough boulder of granite, with the inscription she chose, from Catherine II to Peter I, which manages in 8 words to place herself in the line of legitimate succession she did not otherwise possess. She built an administrative structure that lasted until the Revolution. She brought inoculation to Russia and probably saved a great many lives by her own example. She created the first state education for girls in Europe. She abolished torture in judicial procedure, which was a real and enormous change, and she signed almost no death warrants in 34 years following Elizabeth's precedent, with the notable exceptions of Mirovich and Pugachev. And she left the great question untouched. 20 million people remained the property of somebody else, and more of them were property at the end of her reign than at the beginning. Serfdom would not be abolished for another 65 years, and when it was, in 1861, it was abolished by an emperor who had grown up on the accumulated fear of another Pugachev. Poland was gone and would stay gone for 123 years, and the resentment that created has never entirely dissipated. That is the account. A German girl of 15 came to a country that had eaten its last several rulers and stayed 34 years and made it larger and stronger and more European, and in every place where her own power stood against her own principles, her power won. She wrote her own epitaph, years before she needed it, in a mock inscription she composed for her own amusement and sent to a friend. And it is worth hearing because it is the closest thing we have to her own summary of herself. "Here lies Catherine II," she wrote. "She came to Russia at 14 with the intention of pleasing her husband, the Empress, and the nation. Seated on the throne, she desired nothing but the best for her subjects and tried to give them happiness, liberty, and property. She forgave easily and hated no one. She was good-natured, cheerful, a republican in spirit, and with a kind heart. She made friends. She found work easy. She loved society and the arts. It is charming and it is self-serving, and about half of it is true, and that is a fairly good ratio for anybody's account of themselves. Perhaps the more honest verdict is the one she gave Diderot in the room with the little table between them, when he wanted everything at once and she was tired. He worked upon paper, she told him, which endured anything. She worked upon human skin, which was rather more ticklish. She was not the philosopher she believed herself to be. She was something rarer and less comfortable to admire, which is a first-rate practical politician who had read enough philosophy to know exactly how far short of it she was falling, and who went on falling short anyway, year after year, because the alternative was to lose the throne she had taken with nothing but her nerve on a June morning when she was 33. And here our story settles into stillness. The letters are folded away in their boxes. The galleys are pulled up on the bank of the Dnieper, and their paint has faded. The little rooms above the Neva are quiet. The fire is out, The coffee pot is cold, and the greyhounds have gone to sleep on the floor beside an empty chair. Far to the south, the grass moves on the steppe where the towns were planted, and the sea beyond it is dark and calm and full of stars. The names grow quiet. The years drift like dust on the wind. But the story remains, carried softly into the dark, waiting for whoever comes next to pick it up. Rest now. Let it all go. Sleep well, and good night.